record on this. All right, so we're on started recording virtual book launch for David Bowie and Romanticism, and we're going to start by walking through Savvy Vinyl Records in Melbourne, Florida. And their website is savvyvinylrecords.com, all one word. If you can't find it, they almost always can. And if they can't find it, it's nowhere to be found. Okay, so we're going to walk through the store now. I'm back here in the stock room. There's not much to look at here. Julian's here. All right. Hey, Julian, how you doing? We're just starting, and I'm going to spin the computer around so as soon as I step out of here, so you can see the store, because this is the stock room. All right, so the first room that we're going into, this is the new vinyl room, and you can see all kinds of stuff here. You have the record store day selections back here too. Let me see. Flamin' Groovies, Toto, Death Grips, and this is kind of my favorite section of the store. Dockin', and oh, there's someone you have to meet. Dead Pigeon Rick. You can't pass up on Dead Pigeon Rick. Nirvana in Utero, and Earthless. I'm in love with Earthless. Okay, they're an amazing band. One song, one side. Okay, Agnostic Front, Iggy. Yeah, I think many of these are RSD editions, or some of them are. And this is the main store area. There's Michelle. So you have the country bins here. You have, what is this? I think R&B. Yeah, R&B and soul. There's Michelle. Oh, we're doing great. The glorious Michelle. Yeah. And there's a David Bowie, low on orange vinyl. I haven't decided. Come on, we can see your face, Martha. It's all right. So Martha's Michelle's mom. And there's a medal back over there. Julian's looking for an OG Station to Station.
The hunt is on.
You can find one.
Copy, but I'll find you.
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
the copy I find is cleaner. No.
Yeah.
We'll look for
Yeah,
a
it's
good-
all fair and all fair.
Oh, but do we need a UK copy or a US copy?
I don't know. Let us know, Julian. You want UK or US?
Oh, either one. As long as it's from the 70s, I'm happy with it.
Okay. Do we care if it's on the orange label or the tan label? Because you have the orange label, which is going to be the DMM,
Stuff
the
she
direct
knows
metal
about
master,
vinyl.
or you can go with the tan label, which is just the lacquer cut. I would suggest the lacquer cut. I'm not a huge fan of DMM because they're like really thin and floppy, and then the
Yeah.
tend to be a thicker vinyl that grooves a little bit deeper to last you longer. So,
Yeah, thicker is better.
not using a suitcase record player, are we?
No,
Oh, hell no.
Julian,
No.
Julian has the most significant collection of heavy metal on the Eastern Seaboard.
Okay.
But it's all in boxes behind me. I haven't unpacked my records yet.
Oh no, yeah, they
Just
recently
moved into this
moved.
house. It makes me really sad.
Gotta show me.
Oh yeah, where's the
Show- yeah,
sign? Let's see the
show me
sign. Oh, look at this. Look at that. That's the German cover for The Man Who Sold the World, and it is nuts.
Oh,
I gotta
wow.
buy it, but I have one.
Have to be stupid.
Friends, yeah, that's right. The sign. Friends, don't let friends buy suitcase record player.
Facts. They must all be destroyed. We're gonna take them out back, put some safety glasses on, get a baseball bat, and some gangster music, and we're gonna take them out. They have to be stopped.
And this is a consignment section. She has some 45s here. These are all people selling their vinyl, and she just takes a little commission on it. It's consignment vinyl. And you don't want to miss the Minion. Or Elvira. Or the Gold Skeleton. So, let's see. Looks like, okay, Helen's here. All right. So I am moving back into the little corner here. Our little walkthrough is done for now. And Good. Someone's managed to join us. Okay, good. So I am moving back here. It'll take me a minute to set up. Yeah, let me make sure Instagram is still going too. So, and I definitely want to make sure I'm plugged in. So Instagram is still going. All right. Okay, so let's see. Let me see. Is everybody in the room? It looks like it, yeah. Okay. All right, so let's start. I'm going to introduce Eric Pellerin. He's up first. And I'm going to read his introduction. Here's assistant professor and the electronic resources and serials management librarian at Medgar Evers College, City University of New York. His research interests include genre theory, authorship in film and Hong Kong cinema. He is the author of The Simpsons in Television, Self-Reflexivity as Critique from The Simpsons Did It, Postmodernity in Yellow. That's got to be one of the best book titles.
The editors came up with that. It was good.
Yeah. Edited by Martin Shigerel and Thomas Wallach. If I butchered those names, you can correct me. He is also
Sounds
the
right.
author of Kung Fu Fandom, NYC B-Boys, and the Grindhouse distribution of Kung Fu films from the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies. So you see, he's publishing in music and popular culture. Oxford University Press, edited by Mary Fogarty and Amani Kai Johnson, published May 1st, 2022. It just came out.
Yeah, it actually was supposed to come out then, but due to publishing delays, it will be out October 21st.
Oh, yeah, you don't need to tell me about that.
Yeah.
So tell us about your interest in David Bowie and then your interest in Romanticism. Policy are great.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, so when thinking about this question, I knew of David Bowie, of course, but he wasn't one of my obsessions as far as an artist until I took a class with Professor Edward D. Miller at the CUNY Graduate Center. So I took this class called Documenting the Self, and we did a lot of stuff about rock documentaries. And I had to we watched Penn Baker's Ziggy Stardust film.
Oh, yeah.
So that really got me thinking about Bowie. And plus the readings that we had to do around rock criticism in that class, we did a lot of readings about Bowie. And Edward Miller himself, he wrote this book, Tomboys, Pretty Boys, and Outspoken Women. It was published in 2011. And there's a whole chapter about David Bowie, Aladdin Sane in America.
Right.
So that's really what got me thinking about David Bowie, and the rock criticism stuff was that class, which I absolutely loved that course.
Wonderful.
It was great. Yeah. And so did you wanted me to talk about why I wanted to write this chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how you're working, because your chapter title, I should read it.
Yep.
Drug Use and Drug Literature from the 18th Century to David Bowie.
Yes.
So obviously there's a connection there.
Yeah.
You bring in some interesting figures, from Coleridge and forward. So if you
Yeah.
want to talking about the content of your chapter.
Sure. So, I did want to explore that fully because we all know that David Bowie had an intense period of drug addiction.
Right.
He's well publicized as going on record about that. But I wanted to bring in to focus all of those related figures. So, the Romanticism stuff with Coleridge and De Quincey. Some other people have touched on this in chapters in the book I saw as well.
Right.
The link to creativity and opium use with these Romantic era figures, right? But also heavily figured in Bowie's sort of, I don't know, what to say, legend or just reports, all that stuff, is Aleister Crowley.
Right.
And I knew that the link is very big, and he himself was obviously looked at by rock and roll figures of the time as a romantic figure.
Right.
Because of his use of drugs and his sex at the same time, which are also linked, interestingly, with the mysticism stuff.
Right.
Crowley links them together.
Right.
And I saw David Bowie's examination of that as being relevant to this book. And especially Crowley wrote Diary of a Drug Fiend, in which he mentions Coleridge and De Quincey when he's describing heroin use.
Right.
And I think he says something like, when you take opium, you want to build these golden palaces, but then you lose the inertia. And then he says something funny about heroin, on the other hand, you don't have that problem, which is obviously not true.
Right.
He said that wishful thinking, but
yeah, I mean, I read the novel for the first time earlier this year, and I mean, the couple, they're to the point where they're going to commit suicide together, because of the heroin and cocaine use. So he's good at not being unrealistic about the effects of the drugs.
that was like one of the charitable reviews of the book. Some of them aren't too charitable because it's not good writing, but one of the charitable reviews was that he does a very good job at showing the ecstasy and also how bad it can get when you're addicted to these drugs.
It really shows how you can bottom out with it. It's horrifying. And what the other part of it too, that to me, that's not as I don't know how much notice this gets, but they're just stupid when they're on drugs. They're stupid. He flies his plane until it runs out of gas, crashes it in the ocean. He's lucky there's a boat there. They tow the to shore, and he's like, okay, gas it back up.
It wasn't like showing the genius of the drug use necessarily at any point.
So where do you go from Crowley? How do you move forward from there?
So what really interested me too about Crowley is that David Bowie had this rivalry in the 70s with Jimmy Page.
Right. That's right.
Who is like probably the ultimate Crowley figure in rock and roll. Like collected all the Crowley memorabilia, had links with Kenneth Anger. They had like a little rivalry there too. But I wanted to explore David Bowie's rivalry with Jimmy Page and the Crowley aspect. So, in the beginning of the chapter, I talk about his use of hashish, which he talked about with Cameron Crowe in that famous Playboy interview.
Right.
And he said that was the time that he was most fucked up on drugs, was Man Who Sold the World.
Right.
He was doing a lot of hash. And I saw that parallel of like the opium reveries of these romantic De Quincey and Coleridge being related to the hashish taking that he said the whole album was just hashish influence. And I could see it in, Width of the Circle, the opening track, the epic track. And that, I think I talk about that in the chapter, is that the hashish reveries got mixed up in the literature with the opium reveries. With people like Baudelaire and people, when it got brought back from the East, they just sort of mixed the two together. So they've been conflated. So I saw a relation there. But by the time that Bowie starts doing a lot of coke is at the same time that he has this rivalry with Jimmy Page, where I think he was in I want to say the house, and he's with Jimmy Page, and Jimmy Page spills some wine and tries to blame it on on Ava Cherry, I think, and he tells him to leave through the window, but Page just stays there and just stares at him directly, like a focused
contest of wills.
Exactly. And Bowie was convinced that Page was like using a Crowley type technique to put a spell on him, to show him who's
70s, and there were drugs.
So show him who's boss. So then after that, Bowie decided to compete directly with Page with the Crowley stuff. So since he was doing so much cocaine at the time, living in Hollywood, he wasn't sleeping anyway. So he just read all the books that he could find on Crowley, on the related figures around that, to try to compete with Jimmy Page, which I thought was really fascinating. He's like competing rock figures who I think are the two rock figures of that time period that could be considered the most related to those romantic figures. I mean, Jimmy Page loves all of that stuff. He lives in the Tower House. He still owns the Tower House, which is William Burgess's ornate Gothic revival castle. And he outbid David Bowie. David Bowie's going to buy it. He outbid him for this
They're
house.
competing for the house. How
Yes.
good for that.
Yeah. And so, but they share all those related pre-Raphaelite obsessions. They both went to art school. You know, Jimmy Page in the early period of Zeppelin and before late Yardbirds, he was dressing like a dandy, like walking around in crushed velvet suits, frilled shirts. Like, if anybody, it was those two guys to me.
Right.
And they had that interesting rivalry. So I really wanted to explore all of that stuff.
Yeah, and then connections with a cult and
Mhm.
you know.
Right. So like
No, go
the
ahead.
drug use in Jimmy Page and Bowie, I related to Coleridge never wanted to talk about his drug use. Right. And he didn't want to talk about it on record. But De Quincey, on the other hand, used that whole experience to start his whole career. That's what he was known for. So I saw that parallel with Bowie. He was very open about talking about drug use, no problem. Page pretended like it didn't exist, but everybody knew it was happening.
Right. Especially when he heard his guitar playing around 77 or 78.
Yes.
He
Yes.
got sloppy. He could get sloppy.
Yeah, but that was interesting too. Is Page, he wasn't only doing heroin. I mean, clearly he was doing the classic heroin mixed with cocaine, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to even play those 3-hour shows.
Right.
For an entire 77 tour. But I saw the link with Crowley is the spiritual use of, so the drug use for Crowley was supposed to be enhancing his magical, his magical practices. So he saw drug use as a way to artificially stimulate the stuff that you would get through yoga, which he learned from Alan Bennett. So his idea was, if I can get these similar states through drugs, through meditation and through drugs, why don't we just do it through drugs? Is what he had said. And David Bowie said the same thing in that Bowie on Bowie book, where he noticed that it's very similar to states that he got in meditation, but it's a shortcut. It's not sort of the real thing.
Yeah.
And when you find out at the end, when you're really burned out and addicted to drugs, it's not
for your life.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like you can do that forever.
Right.
I mean, it does work, but it's a shortcut. Like they both had said that basically.
That's interesting.
Whereas I think Crowley never admitted it. Crowley just pretended like I can always I'm not addicted. My will is stronger, but it wasn't true.
Yeah, that was kind of the fantasy the book was projecting. I mean, he was still in Diary of the Drug Fiend. The fictional characters were to the point of suicide, and they were pulled back. But the guru character in the book was like, you can control it.
Yeah, right. And you can control it if you come to my abbey in Sicily, which is like an ad for his. It's just an ad for his own abbey. Right. Free ad. Yeah.
Yeah. So what? I'm not sure we are on time.
Okay.
Bill, you still here? Is Bill here?
Yeah, I see him. Yeah.
All right, good. So, any parting thoughts you'd like to leave us about David Bowie? What he means to you. What do you think he means to our culture?
Sure. I mean, I definitely think that he's obviously one of the major figures in popular culture, of course. But for me, I was specifically focused on the 70s period of David Bowie. And doing this research and investigation with his rivalry with Jimmy Page. Actually, Jimmy Page talks about it in his most recent book, is this book that he released, which is like a catalog of all his whole career, like all of his instruments and amps and everything. And there's a little part where he talks about being a session musician for David Bowie back then.
Right.
And he says, he thought David Bowie was a great writer, which I thought was a compliment, because he doesn't usually compliment too many people. Jimmy
He even
Page,
gave David Bowie a riff that Bowie used.
Yes.
One of his later songs.
I have the record here. Let me just see. It's the Superman. It's the last track on The Man Who Sold the World. So he gave him that riff and he's like, use it if you want to. And he did. So they did have a lot of overlap, but Jimmy Page, it wasn't known to overly compliment, but I saw that and I was like, yes, see, so he is complimenting him.
Right.
But I mean, you know, Bowie was a major figure. And especially I thought that all of that investigation of the occult and the drug use was super interesting, because not people don't cover it in a lot of detail. It's just mentioned in like one sentence or another, but it's not really, as far as I could tell, I haven't seen anybody that tried to really delve into that as much. Wilkin does a little bit in that Low book,
Right.
which I thought was a good jumping off point.
I mean, that's the period where he's trying to escape all that. He just
Right.
He just started to escape all that.
He decided, he made the decision that he better cut back on this. And he said something interesting, which I thought was funny. It's not really funny, but it is back now because he made it through it, where he said he couldn't believe the first cocaine overdose wasn't the one to get him to stop.
Right.
Or the second, even.
Took him 3 times before.
Yeah. So I thought that was
okay. Well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate
sure.
I love your contribution to the collection. If you're just joining us, this is a virtual book launch for David Bowie and Romanticism. Romanticism here is the 18th, 19th century literary artistic phenomenon. And we're all kind of working in that field, and we're bringing the historical insights and theoretical methods and to developed by Romanticism to our study of David Bowie. So what this book is it's a bunch of smart people who we're all academics, and we study 18th, 19th century literature and culture, and we love David Bowie, and we're using our study to see how we can better understand David Bowie. Okay, so up next is Bill Levine. Are you ready, Bill?
It's Levine. Yes, I am ready.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Correct me if I ever get
Only have emailed. We haven't conversed
right.
like this.
It's the first time we've spoken. This is the first time I've spoken to most of you, so this is great. All right, so Bill Levine contributed the chapter on The Man Who Fell to Earth, Capitalist Co-optation, Romantic Resistance, and Bowie's Allegorical Performance, and Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth. And Bill Levine is, let me get his bio up. He is focused the convergences of aesthetics and politics in the latter half of the British long 18th century as his primary field of scholarship. He has published articles on almost every English major poet and literary critic, from Pope, Alexander Pope, early 18th century, to Anna Barbald and Coleridge. More recently, he has been producing a book-length study on the ways that jazz knowledge has informed the history of all major genres of music in Nashville. Wow, that's pretty cool. Jazz in Nashville. That's not usually what we think. This project is an outgrowth of many years spent as a jazz journalist, producing radio interviews and writing for Urban Arts Weekly. So you're in the game. Okay, you perform, you play.
Well, I'll tell you, after the pandemic lockdown, I was taking weekly online lessons, trying to finally learn how to play the piano. It's right here.
Right.
And I've even upgraded from those cheesy 61 key things to a full stage piano, 88 keys. So yeah, you can only get better if you keep doing it every day. I'm reading music much better than I ever have. I never did 2 clefs either. So.
All right, that's great.
And I'm a harmonica player for 15 or more years, so jams, when we get them together, yeah. Okay, chromatic and diatonic, right.
Harmonica counts for a lot.
So, can't do blues with that. And Bowie, of course, finds places for everything, right? He picks and chooses from the whole, range of musical production output, right?
Yeah, all right. So let's
Skills,
talk about your chapter. So what do you have to say about David Bowie and then his performance in The Man Who Fell to Earth? His film
Yeah.
in the 70s.
Well, the allegorical approach is really where I'm going, because, what did Bowie say? He wanted to break free from Ziggy Stardust and his, variants like Halloween Jack and Aladdin Sane at that point in the 70s. And He said he wanted to be free of Ziggy, and of course the Cracked Actor documentary, gave what I think is a false closure to that narrative. But in any case, he then said once he got immersed in this serious art film project with Rowe, he became Newton rather than Ziggy, right? And
Right.
you went through the record store, that cover of Rowe is one of many repurposing stills from this collaborative project with Rowe, Bowie alone in the deserts of New Mexico, the alien landing on Earth. So, is it allegorizing Bowie's career like we used to say as kids when we were following Bowie? Where is he going commercial and Young Americans versus when is he becoming the serious artist working with Eno and Paul Hardcastle even when he's doing the Berlin trilogy? So I thought that dovetailed very well with this exploration, the framework of the book of Bowie hovering between capitalist entrepreneurship and a romantic resistance, right? The book you had us all look at, Sarah and Lowy, Romanticism Against the Tide of Modernity, which, I also had problems with their taxonomy. It was a little too flat. I had to go with Hegelian dialectic approaches to Romanticism for contrast, for criticism. But, certainly is Bowie someone trying to escape at points of his career from that capitalist reduction and subjugation of his, selfhood, of his role as an artist, reducing him, of course, to an entertainer, but or commodity. But on the other hand, how powerful are these vehicles like Rogue's art films and the Berlin trilogy albums that followed in their wake in providing some resistance, even if it's impossible at that point in history to ever escape from capitalist co-optation, another part of my title.
Right. That's very, very complex chapter. You have a lot of moving parts. How does capitalism fit into this?
Yeah, okay, so capitalism is, of course, ingrained in the plot of Man Who Fell to Earth. Even watching it as a teenager, that was the easiest part of the film to grasp. This, alien who can appropriate all of the major, monopolies like DuPont and Kodak at the time for what is ultimately his attempt to save his drought-stricken planet, that dystopian plot, which is really one of the few things Paul Myersberg, the screenwriter, kept from the great Walter Tevis. Every book he wrote became a film adaptation, from The Hustler to The Queen's Gambit, right? Yeah, wow. So capitalism, it almost becomes self-parodied in the hands of probably a somewhat drugged-up film director and writer, but very improvisational, very, creative with whatever's in his hands. He was a very good match with Bowie, Nicholas Rowe. I'm sorry his career didn't have a longer arc before his first four, major provocative art films, and also, taking rock stars like Jagger in Performance, and then later Art Garfunkel, and defamiliarizing them, right? Trying to present them in ways that even question their immersion in some kind of capitalist, market mentality, or as vehicles for pushing capitalism through, if we can bring in Brecht, an alienation effect, which isn't all that far from romantic irony. I think you pushed me to kind of, distinguish or even, collapse the two terms when necessary. So if that answers your question, you could talk about different allegorical layers where what is Rowe trying to do with the film? He really wanted Peter O'Toole first, if he could have gotten the budget for it, right? I think it would have lost a lot if you didn't have Buck Henry, who I got to write to, thanks to a great book, Susan Compo's book, Earthbound. She's a very vigorous entertainment and music journalist based in Los Angeles, like an anteater. She got all the details of this book, great pictures. If no one has come across that, Earthbound, I'd highly recommend it. And, I got into good correspondence with her. She would even tell me about who the ex-wives were of the real people, Buck Henry's romantic partner in that film, and how the hell they get cast, as Rowe looking for money to capitalize this. So, it would have been James Mason, I believe, in Buck Henry's role, and James Coburn in the Rip Torn Pellerin role. But, Candy Clark was Rogue's girlfriend at the time, so she definitely got the romantic lead to Bowie, right? The,
Right.
co-starring billing right before he ended up with Teresa Russell the rest of his life, yeah. So anyway, I mean, I'm rambling around a little bit, but capitalism is on all levels in terms of, production, absorption of the story, in terms of Bowie's career crisis, in terms of this, kind of art house mentality that's supposed to be some pocket of resistance against, Hollywood mentality. I think Paramount wanted Robert Redford actually to do the Bowie role, so, who can guess what's in their mind? They didn't read the book, right? They didn't look at the screenplay,
Yeah, I can't picture anyone but Bowie in that role now. He seemed to own it.
And Myersburg even said he was thinking about Bowie and writing the screenplay even before he knew Bowie was going to be cast. He was hearing the lyrics of Ziggy Stardust and, adapting Tevis's novel.
So okay, Bowie wants to get out of the Ziggy Stardust character, so he plays an alien in a motion picture.
Well, in a more coherent narrative, even if with Nicholas Rogue you have to put coherent in scare quotes, but Bowie and his more even extreme later, the William Burroughs style cut up lyrics. I don't think Bowie ever intended Ziggy Stardust really to be a concept album. It was a lot of improvisation. That's where my jazz mentality comes in, and of course going to the top of the pops with Starman, kind of pushed the narrative line better to the point where Myersburg can really doctor it up and estrange it.
Right. And you mentioned a scene because the film. You mentioned how the film complicates, reading that part back into Bowie's previous career. There's a scene where they're singing in church and Bowie's singing badly.
Right, hilarious.
Mocking his rock star image.
And it's William Blake's Jerusalem set to him in a Mexico church with, this odd documentary style, catching the real parishioners and minister, and then the romantic close-up on, Candy Clark and Bowie, but, a lot of underlying irony there about, the joke on Bowie not being able even to hook on to the lyrics, which, of course, is one of the manifestations that maybe he really isn't a British person in America. Duh. Yeah. So, but just even the ridiculousness of that scene, that this congregation overnight after he got drunk first with Candy Clark could put together this, hymnal arrangement of Jerusalem, which of course is what Bowie's character Newton is trying to find in Earth, a resettlement, another version of America. As critics said about this film, it could have been like 6 different films if one idea had been sustained. Otherwise, everything is thrown into the blender in terms of the genre hopping, right?
Right. Have you paid much attention to that Broadway show he staged at the very end of his life, Lazarus?
Yeah. Well, Susan Campo had a very good chapter on that. And Bowie was even more immersed with, jazz people later in career, like you did Black Star, with Donnie McCaslin and so on. But I think his illness really impacted the full kind of potential of that show. But certainly it's returning to that earlier theme about America as a promised land that Bowie was, scared to death even of immersing himself too much in American culture, and the scenes in Man Who Fell to Earth that are appropriating the Cracked Actor documentary, right? Bowie going through cocaine psychosis in the back of his limousine and casting Bowie's driver. He didn't want to fly. At that point in his career, he was just traveling through that limousine from station to station, so to speak, in America. So, I could probably write more about Bowie after all the work I put into this. And, I think that later element of his career, the revisiting, in that Lazarus play as well as in the final album and the video productions with it, certainly giving us a final statement on the transitional phase of his, Earthman and, whatever magical discovery of America as the promised land, just like a Thomas Newton figure. I mean, he's doing that in Scary Monsters to some degree, too, going back to the Major Tom figure, right?
Right. Okay, well, thank you. Now, one thing I should have done, but I'm going to do now is open it up for questions a little bit. Samuel Gladden had a couple questions for you, and if anyone has
Sure.
questions for Eric, now's a good time to ask too. And then I think Sam's up next. So any questions? So yeah, Sam, why don't you ask your question?
Could I just make a brief plug?
Yeah, go
Perfect
ahead.
convergence again. The art house in Nashville, the Belcourt Theater, is doing a whole month of David Bowie films, even the bad ones, right?
Yeah.
So on October 2nd, I will be giving the introduction to Man Who Fell to Earth in a big 1920s style theater.
Oh,
So
man.
even if there's not many people who live in or near Nashville listening to this, if you just like hopping art houses like I like to do whenever I'm visiting the city, that would be the event to attend. Be there or be square, right? October 2nd, 5 o'clock. Yeah.
That's fantastic, man. What a great thing they're doing too.
Mhm.
I wish I could be there. Somehow I'm around Nashville, I'll drop in.
Okay.
So, okay.
Yeah, I think they're even getting his Zoolander cameo in there, but I'm not going to introduce that one. Okay.
That's right.
The underwear pulling fashion contest,
Are they
whatever that
doing the
was.
vampire film?
Yeah, with Susan Sarandon, right?
Yeah,
I
that one,
think
yeah.
that's on the agenda, but what is it? Absolute Beginners, that's definitely in there. Yeah, so I'm at the end of the month. I think they saved the best for last in terms of
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Samuel, you have a question?
I do. So, Bill, thank you so much for your fantastic chapter. I've enjoyed all the chapters in the book. This is my favorite movie, and I always want to learn more about it. So thank you for what you've written about that. I wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about what you characterized today in your comments about the false closure of the Ziggy Stardust era. Just tell us what you're thinking about with that.
More like, God, I wish I could remember all these names. Who was the director of the Cracked Actor documentary on BBC? Is it Iacobus or something? Yeah. I mean, that was his big claim to fame, that he could follow Bowie all through the American tour and give what I think is still something of a formulaic documentary for that time in Bowie's career, where he's consumed by his own success. And certainly Bowie was saying that in his interviews at the Times too. So the arc, if I can call it that, of that documentary, I think anybody, by the way, can get it now on Internet Archives. Yeah, because I helped Susan Campo find it too. So showing him both, I think, exulting in that character and putting in what would have been the equivalent of video performance clips, for doing his theatrical treatment of Space Oddity at the time. Just basically showing him morphing at the end into what he called Plastic Soul, the Philadelphia sound appropriation of young Americans, taking off his makeup and disguise, but premature because the film said nothing about his Halloween Jack and Aladdin Sane personae as an evolution of Ziggy. It made it into this, sort of I'm stepping away from being a teen idol, even though the film interviewed very enthusiastic, kids dressing up in ways they thought were consistent with Bowie's alien or stranger ethos. So, it definitely is a narrative that needed to be deconstructed when we think about his immersion in this film. Nothing about that in the documentary, even as Rogue is, appropriating scenes from that film and in a way commenting on that, fame, the Bowie, duality of theatricalizing success as well as the downfall, the destruction of it, which of course is there in the Ziggy Stardust songs as well. Rise and Fall. Yeah. So is that answering your main question, Sam?
Yes, absolutely. And I would just say
Okay.
also, I love the section where you talk about at the very end of the movie, such a long movie. I watch it all the time, often don't get all the way through it because it is such a long movie, but I love the movie. I love your meditation on the record shop section and the bizarre incidents of the David Bowie album actually being for sale in the record shop where, his album is for sale as Thomas Newton as well.
Right. Rogue is definitely doing something with product placement there, including, Thomas Newton's promotion of world enterprises, right? Beaming it up in secret signals to his wife there in his home planet and Anthea. Yeah. So only Rip Torn can do that kind of scene, I think, of wandering through the record shop and then, meeting the man he betrayed basically in this kind of Judas role, which is more obvious in Tevis's novel with Newton as a Christ figure. So I'm glad you like that, and I know Jim liked my kind of almost inadvertent, accidental, almost digressive passage comparing the plot of Men Who Fell to Earth with Lamia and the destruction of that, romantic ideal or fantasy through, rationalization, modernity, or publicity, if you want to talk about Lamia's romantic partner besides Apollonius the philosopher. Okay, well, thanks. I'm running for political office too. I'm doing too many things, but I'm told I should spend all my free time on canvassing and fundraising. So I'm going to be like Lord Byron, enter the House of Lords here in Tennessee, right? Screaming Lord Byron if, you want to go back to an awful David Bowie phase of the Blue Jean album. But I wish I could be here for the whole time, but I'll definitely catch everybody on the recording. So thanks for your interest. But if there are other questions, certainly have another 15 minutes or so.
So, okay, any other questions? Any for Eric as well? Hey, Paul, good to see you there. Okay, so I think Sam is up next. Samuel, you ready to start?
I am ready.
All right. Okay, so let me introduce you if you don't mind. And you recently changed institutions. That's pretty cool. Samuel Gladden serves as professor of English and dean of the College of Liberal Arts Education and Human Development at the University of New Orleans. That's your new place. And he has published widely on key figures in 19th century British literature with books on Percy Shelley, published by Routledge, Oscar Wilde, Broadview, and articles on Mary Shelley, Wilkie Collins, Bram Stoker, and others. And this is his second chapter on David Bowie. Yeah, you contributed to the first Rock and Romanticism book, the chapter Manner, Mood, and Message, Bowie, Morrissey, and the Complex Legacy of Frankenstein. That was in Rock and Romanticism, Blake, Wordsworth, and Rock from Dylan to U2. That was Lexington Books in 2018, I believe. So thank you for contributing then, and thank you again for contributing now. And your chapter now is, hold on a minute, let me read the chapter title. Rebel Rebel, Bowie as Romantic Type. So tell me, why Bowie for you, and why Bowie and Romanticism?
Gosh, what a big question. So Bowie for me, I've been a David Bowie fan for a long time. I came to David Bowie at what Bill just referred to as a rather unfortunate period. That is the, the mid 80s when I was in high school.
Yeah, right.
I think the first David Bowie album that I owned was Never Let Me Down, which David Bowie himself said is his worst album.
Yeah,
Because I did not have a refined sense of musical taste at the time. I loved it.
I think it's unfairly treated.
Yeah, well, I think so, and I think that the representation of that a couple of years ago shows that it really is quite a beautiful album that was just caught in bad production. And I think the Glass Spider tour as well that promoted that is also something that is being appreciated differently these days as one of the first truly theatrical productions that used the verticality of the stage in ways that hadn't been done before. I only saw David Bowie performed once. That was in the Sound and Vision tour in Austin. But the use of the scrim and the projections around him to maximize the verticality of the stage was really quite stunning, and I think grew from the Glass Spider tour. So all that is to say that that's how I came to David Bowie. I didn't really realize how much I used David Bowie in my teaching, because before I was an administrator, I was, of course, a classroom teacher as a professor. But when David Bowie died, I was asleep, and I got a phone call from a former student of mine, because many, many years ago, we all gave our cell phone numbers to students on our syllabi in ways
Yeah,
that
right.
I certainly hope no one does these days, but we did in those days. And I got this phone call from a number in Iowa where I had lived for many years and taught for many years. And it was this former student of mine. And I hadn't heard from him from years, except for seeing him on Facebook. And he said, "Are you watching the news?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Turn on CNN." And so I did, and David Bowie had died. And I later on called him back to ask him, to say thank you, but why did you call me to tell me about this? And the point that I'm getting to is that I didn't realize how frequently I referred to David Bowie in class and used primarily videos, but also music, and sometimes Bill, the Man Who Fell to Earth, to illustrate aspects of literary theory and interpretation, and talk about a wide range of subjects that are of interest to English majors and are important to our classes. So that's how I came to David Bowie. And you can hear dogs barking in the background. I apologize for that. Since then, I wrote the first chapter, Jim, for your first collection, combining David Bowie and Morrissey, two people who have a rather contentious relationship.
Right.
And was delighted that you were doing an entire volume on David Bowie, and so here we are.
Right. That's great. That's great. So you seem to break up Bowie's creative production into periods,
Yeah.
and you identify defining characteristics of each period. So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think that the Bowie that you know is the Bowie that you came to, depending upon when you discovered him, whether it's in your own life or you picked up an album in a record store, and that was your first exposure to Bowie. And so that's the Bowie that you know. And of course, underlying all this is the fact that we never really knew David Bowie, and there never actually was a David Bowie, since that was a pseudonym, right? There was Robert Jones. There was no such person as David Bowie. I do think that, as my chapter discusses, that in the last phase of his life, starting really in the 1990s, but especially around 2000, and then with the reality tour and so forth, David Bowie presented himself in a way that seemed more normal. And I use that word really in quotation marks, but more normal to the world. He wasn't a flamboyant theatrical figure like Ziggy Stardust or others that he had embodied before. He seemed to be David Bowie. But part of what fascinates me is that he never really was. And even that, I think, was a performance of normality, but also a performance of normality in the midst of David Bowie being so innovative. I mean, thinking about things in the 90s, like being the first major artist to release a complete album online. Introducing Bowie bonds. He made $55 million by letting people borrow his royalties for 10 years, and then he got them back. What kind of economic genius is that? To innovate that. So even in what seemed to be the most normal, as I call the chapter, the most normative phase of his life, he was doing things that reflected opportunities to change culture. And he was changing culture in the things that he was doing.
Right. That's great. But of those three periods, I mean, which one stands out to you?
The last period, because even though I came to him, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, with Never Let Me Down, sort of in the mid to late 80s. When I was in high school, of course, David Bowie was this iconic MTV figure with Let's Dance and Modern Love and China Girl and the Blue Jean video, Bill, that you referred to a few minutes ago. Actually, I think I kind of like it more than you do, and maybe we should talk about that at some point. I think there's some interesting things that are happening there, part of which I discuss in my chapter. But for me, the David Bowie that stands out for me is the David Bowie of the 90s and the early 2000s. And part of it is the Outside album, which I think is just a work of absolute genius. I think it's so regrettable that he didn't finish what was proposed as a trilogy of Brian Eno. Part of it is just seeing all these rapid transitions that he went through. His silent, what I call the Greta Garbo period of his life, when he was just absent for a long time because of his health conditions and heart attacks and so forth. And then all of a sudden he was just back. And he wasn't back in a quiet way. He was back in a very aggressive way of reintroducing himself with The Next Day and giving these very provocative videos and compositions that changed the way that we think about who David Bowie was. And then, of course, carrying on from then to the end with Black Star was just an incredible last arc to his career.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one, you can tell me what you think about this. Oh, Aglaia is here. Yay. And in case you haven't noticed, Julian has been transformed into a cat.
Yeah.
So anyways, one thing, and I think this came up, is that, the shift away from the glam period
Right.
was accompanied by a really intense focus on the music itself. I mean, glam rock, come on, it's just rock and roll with lipstick on, okay? I mean, musically, it's not distinguishing itself at all. I just played the New York Dolls' first album, and that's a garage band, man. But they're dressed like women. They look like a hair metal band from the 80s almost. 10 years before, and that's what makes them glam. But then he starts really getting interested in the music. With Young Americans, that was the first thing.
Yeah.
He recaptures his musical identity by connecting to the Black community in New York City and recruiting musicians from the Apollo, and that's where he picked up Carlos Alomar, and Luther Vandross,
Right.
is on that album, and nobody knew him when that came out.
Mhm.
And you read reception histories, and one book I read was the fandom of David Bowie, and the Black community in New York still is appreciative of him for that. So he recovers his own musical roots, which is Black American music, going back to Coltrane and Mingus and Little Richard in 59, his 45s, his father bought him. And then he collaborates with Brian Eno and moves to Germany, and other people will talk about this period in more detail, and that's when his musical, his music changes, and he changes music.
He did, and he did so in a way that was not appropriation, right? So
Right.
Madonna is often criticized for appropriating house style with voguing, and I think rightly so. He didn't do that because he depended upon the musicians who were already producing that music to
Right.
educate. And
They
then
appropriated
as
him.
you just mentioned, he promoted them. Luther Vandross was not known until that moment, and then he only became more and more famous as his own career.
Right. Yeah. He
So,
kind of took off.
I think part of what he did is he appreciated a variety of types of cultures, musical and otherwise, arts cultures, book
Right.
cultures, all kinds of cultures, and he was in a position to promote those individuals, and he did. And of course, famously in the early 80s on MTV, when he was interviewed, he sort of stopped the interview by pointing out what a racist network this was,
Right.
because music was all about Black music and was coming from African-American artists, but hardly anyone aside from Michael Jackson ever got played on MTV. And he
Right.
just asked
He
the
asked
question, where are all the Black
MTV
artists? I mean,
Right.
he really was someone who was in a position of great privilege. And by that time, he was wealthy,
Mhm.
and he was white, and he was male. And he used those positions of privilege to ask the questions that trouble culture, to introduce the good trouble, and
Yeah.
to force social change. And I think that he did that very much in his life and his work. And you think about an album like, let's see, is it Black Tie, White Noise, I think is the title of that album, where he invited so many artists from the African-American community to collaborate with him. And then he promoted them, not just on the album, but also in videos, featured them very strongly in ways that brought them to public attention because of his position of privilege. So part of what I appreciate about David Bowie in that last phase of his life, when he was so famous and had so much influence and was so powerful, is the way in which he used that influence to help reshape culture and to introduce individuals to culture who might have been overlooked.
Right. That's great. How about the idea of the romantic type?
Well, what about that? We could say, I mean, the whole book is about that, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. What would
So,
you like to contribute to that?
Well, I
briefly.
of course, the really easy way into that is Screaming Lord Byron from the
Right.
Jazz in Blue Jean video, right? And I say Jazz
Right.
in because that's the way it's actually spelled in the video title.
Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant incorporation of a different culture on David Bowie's part, because he understands the rock star cachet of the poet during the Romantic era. I mean, they were
Right.
the rock stars of their era. And if you watch really bad movies about them, like Haunted Summer and things like that, you see how, they have these fan bases and people followed them and so on. But more importantly than that, just as the Romanticists sought to critique their world in ways that would lead to social change, to open up their world to change by way of their art, so did David Bowie. He's doing the same thing that they did. And part of what I love about your work in the first 2 chapters, Jim, in the book, is that you talk about Romanticism as a concept that not so many years ago we thought of in chronological terms. But you're encouraging us to think about this in ideological terms, to think about how Romanticism is not constrained to a certain, 30 or 40-year period, but in fact continues to this day. It's about a perspective, it's about intention, it's about intentionality and the view of changing the world for the better. And that's what I think that the Romantics sought to do, and that's what David Bowie sought to do as well.
Yeah, and we need to talk about Romanticism, because obviously this is David Bowie and Romanticism. That's a unique I think one of the unique contributions of this collection. And going back to Sayer and Louvie, 2 things that they say is that Romanticism it's not an idea, okay, it's a feeling, it's an impulse, and it can be in contradiction to the ideas that people actually have.
Mhm.
Right? It may not be consciously held. It's just a feeling. It's an impulse first. And the second thing is it's embedded in modernity. Romanticism is modernity's own self-criticism.
Mhm.
So modernity, it never escapes modernity. So as modernity transforms, so can romantic responses to it, the romantic reaction, the impulse.
Mhm.
So that, to me, that makes it possible to break the boundaries of period. And my own thesis about Romanticism is kind of whacked. I hope to write in more detail about it in the future, but I believe it really starts with Milton's Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
The combination of the pastoral and the Gothic in the same setting, and the introduction of Satan as a character that you can sympathize with,
Mhm.
which you have some of that in gosh, I'm losing my mind, in Sydney, but you don't sympathize with the devil in Sydney.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. So and then of course the romantics and many people after Milton that weren't romantic, built on his work and his creative energy, and that's why I believe it continues into the present. And rock and roll is just a modern expression of the romantic impulse.
Mhm.
So all right, any questions for do you want to be called Samuel or Sam?
I prefer Samuel.
Samuel, okay, all right. So or Dr. Gladden, Dean Gladden?
Samuel's fine.
Samuel, good. Okay. Any questions? And as you can see, Julian is now transformed into his human form. He's no longer a cat.
Oh, good.
It's good to see you. So, okay. Well, that was great. Thank you for contributing. I'm trying to remember who's next here. Let's see. Yeah, Aglaia is here. And so we can, I believe she's up now. Are you ready? It's
Yes.
great to meet you.
Great to meet you.
Yeah. So
Collaborations that we haven't met
yeah,
yet.
right. This is great. So I'm gonna introduce the book, and I'm gonna read your introduction here, and then we'll go into your chapter. So if you're just joining us, this is the virtual book launch for David Bowie and Romanticism, out by Palgrave Macmillan about 2 weeks ago, I guess. And it's an edited anthology, and we're having a discussion with almost all the contributors. So Aglaia, is that how you say your first name?
Aglaia.
Aglaia, okay,
Aglaia.
sorry. Yeah, Aglaia. This is the first time we've actually spoken.
I know.
That was pretty cool. So Aglaia
Yes. Mhm.
Venters,
Mhm.
okay, and wrote about the Goblin King, absurdity and non-binary thinking. So I'm so happy that the two biggest Bowie films are represented in this book, which is The Man Who Fell to Earth and The Labyrinth. Labyrinth. So I would have been sad if they weren't both covered, but they both were. So I'm really grateful for both of those contributions. So Aglaia Venters is, hold on a minute, instructor in the history department of South Louisiana Community College. Her publications include an essay on Hegelian dialectic in Reading as Democracy in Crisis, Interpretation Theory History. And thank you for that chapter. That's one of my edited ones. Her upcoming publications include essays on French Renaissance political theory and Jesuit paradigms for tensions between reason and faith. So that's going to be really interesting. And that almost sounds kind of related to what you're writing about Bowie here.
Yes.
And her ongoing projects focus on the experiences of individuals whose lives and work represent ideas that mainstream society accepts only posthumously. We come around, but why late? So,
Yes.
so what do you want to say about David Bowie in your life first, and then we'll slide into the labyrinth.
Okay. Depends on how corny you want me to get.
Oh, be corny. We're fans, right? We're all fans. Is that
We're
right?
all fans, okay. So I think I was about 7 when Labyrinth came out, and like a lot of young girls of that, in that era, I became like completely intrigued and all of that. And it just got worse when I got into my teenage years. Also, that movie, I shared that movie with 2 of my friends when we were in college. And well, more than just those 2, but they passed away. One of them was Angela. Her name was Angela Lukens, and she passed away in 2013. And then one of them, unfortunately, passed away after a 15-month battle with COVID.
Oh, that's too bad.
2021, December 2021. So it's kind of like remembering them in this particular process also. Well, part of the reason why I was so intrigued by David Bowie in Labyrinth, especially, even at that young age, was that well, one, I didn't understand why I was so intrigued by this guy who comes in looking like this scary person with this crazy wig and I was like, why is he wearing so much glitter? He's a boy, he's wearing all this glitter, but for some reason I was so taken in. But also, I mean, even at that young age, though, I remember thinking, identifying with the lead female character, the protagonist, Sarah, and thinking that she was a brat, first of all.
Yeah.
Even
was at the beginning total.
And then also, I remember it stuck with me that she passed the teddy bear on to the baby at the end.
Right.
So that meant something to me even at that time, that the Goblin King Jareth was a teacher. So.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, that's something you really emphasize in your chapter too. Like Jareth is supposed to be the antagonist, the bad guy. And you complicate that in your chapter. Why does non-binary thinking have to be kind of deconstructed, and how does that relate to Romanticism and to David Bowie?
Okay, so the short version of the story with Romanticism, as you were saying earlier, that it is modernity critiquing itself. A lot of the self-critique that I see in Romanticism of modernity is that this idea that you can actually put things into get everything into some sort of rational, categories, all of that stuff. And that was something that I always struggled with those particular ideas of the, Enlightenment, if you must, and French Revolution and stuff like that. Those were things that I always struggled with as well. And so Romanticism actually, especially considering the story between I don't know if I could call it a dichotomy, because I don't want to call it a dichotomy, but Lord Byron versus his daughter, Ada Lovelace. And okay, meanwhile, all of that, for all of her mother's like you're not going to be crazy like your father, you're going to be all scientific and everything, for all of that, her main contribution to computer science was that she was the only one who was creative enough to see that a calculating machine doesn't have to just calculate numbers. So it was but also the girl is a scientist. That's one of the reasons why I see non-binary thinking as a big part of, in the Enlightenment, women were not exactly rational creatures. And then with Byron and his daughter, she's the rational one, he's the irrational one, but then her creativity ends up being a major part of her contribution to science of all things in the end. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the next collection is coming out is Women in Rock, Women in Romanticism. So I really have to focus on how women were viewed, throughout history and how that changes or can begin to change in Romanticism.
Mm-hmm.
And she's Jennifer Connelly's character is involved in a dialectic of her own. I mean, she transforms from a brat who wants her baby brother taken away. She's complaining about having to babysit. I mean, and because her parents are going out. And that was just a little too much like real life. That part of the film's kind of traumatized. I have kids, and she grows into having to, through the process of having to fight to recover her baby brother, she matures out of that. You know? So you see that, and the character of Jareth, doesn't he change in relationship to her as well?
Yes.
He's not a stable character in your description of him. Would you like to elaborate on that?
He's not a stable character. Now, a lot of it has to do with the fact that as she changes, so does he. Because a lot of what's going on is her perception of things. And he's the teacher, and he's changing because a good teacher will actually modify what they do as the student is learning more and growing and everything. So he has to change things as she does, but also her perception of him changes along the way too. And also his methods of dealing with her change, because at first he'll just say something mean, like she says, "It's not fair. And I wonder what the basis of your comparison is."
Right.
But then it gets even more mean when give her the peach and let her dream and realize that the dream that's all it is. It's just a dream. So it gets more and more mean towards the end, but I think it's because of the fact that he has to be, it's finals. Okay, this time you were in first grade, now you're in third grade, now it's time for you to graduate from high school, and the courses have to get more rigorous and the tests have to get more rigorous, and finally she passes.
Yeah, right. Of course. Would the ultimate test be that ballroom scene where he's tempting her to become like his consort?
I think when it comes to the ultimate test, that's a toss-up between the ballroom scene and the end, when
like the Maisie kind of thing, right?
Right. It's a toss-up for me between those two. The ballroom scene, I think, is when she really starts to get it, when she really starts to figure out, because all of these people are in masks around her. She's the only one who's vulnerable and not wearing a mask. And then she realizes, wait a minute, this isn't right. That's why. But then that time at the end, the part at the end when he comes out in this angelic white costume, which also always struck me. It's like, okay, now you're an angel. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, right.
He's explaining to her just how, like, it's your last chance to have this very dysfunctional, abusive relationship with me. Are you sure you want to go? And she has to remember the line that he has no power over her and pop the bubble. So it's kind of a toss-up between those two. Yeah. I think in the end she was still tempted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's realizing her own agency and her own power.
Mm-hmm.
That's the so instead of complaining like she was and living in that fantasy world, I mean all the elements of the Jareth universe are kind of there, and he's the owl at the beginning, right?
Right. Yes, I saw him as more like mentor, the Athena aspect with the owl. Right. Yeah, is definitely a teacher. So
do you feel like was he deliberately a teacher? Is he actually a person or a psychological force?
I think of him as a little of both, a person and a psychological force, because a lot of the time, though, it's our projections that we put onto people.
Right.
And so a teacher's never just a teacher. There's a lot that goes on with psychological projection of students onto their teachers, and it happens whenever we meet anyone.
Right.
So in the case with Jareth, though, I think he's also showing her that he's very different from what she really thinks, the person that she thinks he is. But also, he's not, there's so much complexity there, though, because at one time she's like, oh, you're the one who's going to rescue me from having to take care of this baby. Well, that rescuer is not so hot, not so
Right.
cool. He's not a handsome prince who
Not
comes
all
in.
that.
Okay, then he comes in, he's the prince at the ball. Not so good either. That wasn't what you thought it would be either. Then at the end, he's still this, kind of tempting and everything. And he says, I have, you wanted me to be frightening. I did. I was frightening for you. You told me to take the baby. This is all in your mind.
Right. I'm just being what you want me to be.
I think
like,
that's also how he treats the audience too. I wrote that in my essay. He treats the audience that way. You can decide when your fantasy about
right.
ends. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting how Bowie's personae all kind of converge on the Jareth in that movie too.
Mhm.
Like his space alien stuff kind of converged on Thomas Jerome Newton and The Man Who Fell to Earth.
Mhm.
It's almost like Bowie is commenting on Bowie and Jareth.
Right. Mhm.
There's an element of self-reflexivity there.
Right. Yes. He's
Yeah.
actually, it's really interesting though, because that famous line, I got my sexual awakening from this movie.
Yeah,
That's
right.
women said.
Women say that. The
Okay,
cod
but
piece.
it's really interesting though, because Bowie put himself up to be the one who was objectified.
Right.
And he's the most objectified character in the movie. And you can actually decide how far you want that fantasy to go. You
Right.
can shut it off at any time. If it starts to get a little too scary for you, you can shut it off.
Right.
Or if you choose not to actually see him in a sexualized way, you can also choose that. He's
Right.
kind of do what you want.
Yeah.
But that's how he was with a lot of things. So
Right. So he was Bowie even as Jareth, and Jareth is commenting on Bowie as well.
yes.
You know? So it's a dialectic, but it's not necessarily binary, it's
No.
yeah, just Bowie being Bowie kind of destabilizes all his relationships.
Right.
Yeah.
But then also he's not actually, you still don't even know who the real Bowie is. He's still Bowie.
Right.
How do you know that that's,
Well, you see, it's the real person is David Jones, and
Mhm.
Bowie is a public persona.
right.
And the way I present their relationship is like Bowie's a canvas and David Jones is the artist
Right.
painting on the canvas. And I saw Moon Age Daydream last night. I wanted to make sure I saw the movie before the event, and an interviewer asked him at one point, so Bowie is a canvas and you're just painting on you're painting it yourself, and Bowie agrees. And I would even put more distance there. I'd say Bowie is a canvas, but David Jones is a painter.
Mhm.
And I believe Bowie was used to distract attention away from the real David Jones.
Yes.
All the outrageous persona, that kept the real person behind that from public view.
Right. Right.
And his reasons for wanting to do that, I think would be interesting to explore if we could.
It would be very hard though.
Yeah, I think it would be
Gave us a
hard. That's the
lot
whole
to
point.
grasp.
It's obscuring.
Mhm.
So what else? What ideas do you want to leave with us about David Bowie?
Okay. Thinking in terms of, I think that Labyrinth was also about maturity. Because, in the Romantic era, you have this issue of, women are supposed to take care of children and be this, kind of go-between for the child and the adult. The adult is a real adult, is a fully rational male. And the child is this innocent, kind of, I don't know, cute thing. Anyway, though, woman's not going to be on the level of a rational male, though, but she's not a child either.
Right.
I think that with Bowie, though, in Labyrinth, though, he's showing that when it comes to also the gender norms in that particular, he doesn't buy it. He's not believing
Right.
it. And so, and that's
Right.
one of the reasons why he comes in looking like Lord Byron, like a Byronic, yeah, character and everything. But with that kind of 1980s flair. And so it's I think that also the definitely the gender I guess fluidity there
Yeah.
was really something that it's one of the things that people, you know, pick up on the most because it's a visual aspect. And so I
Right.
think that it's really about showing that, well, not only any child, I guess any child has to at some point grow up, but the way to grow up is by actually saying, taking responsibility for your own thoughts instead of actually believing these categories, good
Right.
versus evil and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's easy to just believe what you're told, but how about, you're responsible for what you choose to believe. You
Right.
can question it. So, all right, that's great. Any questions? Any questions? Let's see.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, go on.
Uh,
Have at it.
Hi.
Jennifer, I think you had your hand up as
Oh,
well. I think you were
yeah.
before me.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Jennifer.
I was just wondering, hi, James. I was wondering about the end and how you interpret it, because I found that actually kind of fascinating, because even though she's matured as an individual and she's now going to take responsibility, she still embraces the fantastical, and her stuffed animals are still real beings who
Right.
are going to be there for her when she needs them. So I
Oh,
just
Beth.
wondered if you could speak to that, because I was waiting for that when I read your chapter, and I found your chapter fascinating, and I wonder if you could interpret that end
The
for
way
me.
that I saw that is that she said, every once in a while, I will need you. And they said, well, why didn't you say that? So I think that it's also that maturity isn't a complete and total rejection of the fantastical. I think that if people thought of maturity as a complete and total rejection of the fantastical, then they've kind of missed the point. So I think that that's really what that's what it signified to me. But also she had passed the torch to her brother. So she had already done that. But after that, though, she says, the like the creatures and everything and the stuffed animals and everything, they're saying goodbye to her. But then she said, I might need you still. And I mean, even adults have their daydreams and everything. And for adults to completely reject that, well, then that's going back to the category of child versus adult, these absolute categories. And that's not the point of maturing. So.
And that's very romantic
Thank
too.
you.
That's Wordsworth, isn't it?
Mhm,
Right?
mhm.
You know,
Yes.
twinkling clouds of glory, So Jennifer, did you want to add to that?
No, I liked that definition. I felt that it also kind of fit in with not having these strict categories or binaries, because
Mhm.
there's a sense that, per the romantic vision, like you could be a rational person and include the fantastical, and maybe what's seen as more innocent within yourself and identity. So I like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Samuel had a question too, right?
I did a comment and a question. I was thinking about what you said about David Bowie and Labyrinth and the hypersexualization of David Bowie that, is sort of almost comical in a way because of
Yeah, right.
infamous cod piece and so on, and that so many young people, females and males, I would imagine, were quite startled and interested in that. I came to Labyrinth late in life because I was in college when it came out, and it seemed kind of dorky as a kid's movie, and so it wasn't until many years later that I actually saw Labyrinth. But I appreciate the cultural reception of that for David Bowie's codpiece. What I wanted to ask you about, though, was something that is typical of what he did many times in his career, which is looking back on the past and incorporating aspects of the past, whether it is in a dance move or a lyric or an outfit. So when he did the Louis Vuitton commercial toward the end of his life, that is obviously based on Labyrinth. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but it's a
remember that
replay of the ballroom scene from Labyrinth. And so he's recalling that. He's moving that into a very obviously capitalistic context because he's selling a product. So I mean, if you haven't seen it, then I recommend it because I love that song and I love that mix of the song that's specific to the commercial. But it's interesting to me that once again, he's going back to an iconographic image of himself and then appropriating that to do something else. So maybe could you talk about self-appropriation and the way in which Bowie represents himself by thinking about earlier guises in his career?
Well, what I wrote about in one of the things that I thought was interesting, though, and I wrote about this in the chapter, was that Bowie, you couldn't actually tell really whether or not Jareth is a concert, one of his own concerts. And that's one of the things that I thought was interesting about that, is that the way that I felt about it was that, well, as I got older, when I was 7, I had no idea what I was, I was looking at, though. But the way that I kind of saw it, though, is that, okay, is this the same kind of, is Labyrinth just another one of his concerts, like one of his stage performances, like Ziggy Stardust? So I kind of felt like he recalled a lot of just his stage presence in Jareth, especially when you're watching these, rock videos. Now with Magic Dance, that's the most obvious point where it's like, this is such an 80s rock video.
Right. That was one of Bowie's contributions too. That was one of his songs.
But also it was looking like, okay, this is something that I would actually expect to see on a stage more so than in a movie. Especially, okay, that part when he's just like dancing around and you could see like it's pretty funny. And then he's like pointing at the baby. And then he didn't even like the baby gurgles. He made his own baby gurgles, which I'm still trying to figure out exactly how so I'm trying to figure out how he was able to do that. So that's what I really think, is that he channeled just the fact that, I wasn't looking for exactly the references to his earlier work, though. It's probably something I should look at later on, though. But I know that definitely, though, I got the impression that a lot of it was about just the fact that he's a stage performer. His entrance when he walked in also, and she says, "You're him, you're the Goblin King." It looks like a rock star walking in to the stadium, and all the girls start screaming and everybody starts like freaking out and everything. So yeah, I really found he's a stage performer within a movie, and he's able to pull it off. A lot of the time, though, movie versions of musicals don't actually work so well, but it's because he was actually a stage performer, not an actor on screen all of the time who happens to be in a musical, a movie version of a musical. The fact that he actually knew how to have stage presence, I think, helped him there. So
that's good. Anything else? Any other questions for any of our prior? Okay, can we move on? I think. All right, thank you. Thank you for your contribution and thank you for being here. And I believe Paul Rowe is up next. Is that right? Yes, Paul Rowe, then Jennifer, and then Julian. And Julian and I will have some other things to talk about too, because we have another project coming up. So Paul, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So let me introduce you. If you're just tuning in, this is the virtual book launch for David Bowie and Romanticism, Palgrave Macmillan 2022. We're live on location at Savvy Vinyl Records in Melbourne, Florida. Website savvyvinylrecords.com. That'll take you to her Discogs page. And it's at 28 Laurie Street in Melbourne, Florida. Great independently owned, woman-owned and operated record store. So Paul, let me introduce Paul. Hold on. Introduction from the book. Is an adjunct lecturer at Endicott College, bookshop sales associate, and a music writer for Pop Matters. And there's a lot of your music writing around, right? There's a lot out there. His literary criticism appears in Literary Imagination and Literary Matters. He holds an MA in English Literature from the University of New Hampshire and a BA in English from Suffolk University. So, and your chapter is, hold on a minute, writing about the so-called Berlin period. Hold on a minute. Relics of the Future, the Melancholy Romanticism of Bowie's Berlin Triptych. Okay. So start talking. Tell us about you and David Bowie and how you tie his Berlin albums to Romanticism.
Yeah, so this was a long time coming for me. I started writing the essay like 7 years ago, and and we talked on
Yeah,
the
we
phone.
talked back then. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked back then. We talked on the phone. My essay couldn't be in the original Rock and Romanticism anthology. I think because I was still in grad school at the time,
Yeah.
and I was working on it. But my relationship with Bowie goes back to when I was in high school. I got really into Bowie. I fell in love with the man who fell to earth and all the classic albums, but the ones that I gravitated the most to were Heroes, Low, and Lodger.
Yeah.
Always, because they're so mysterious and they're so brooding and there's something genuine about them. I think like we kind of get to the heart of what Bowie is all about a little bit more than we do, I think, in his other works. And everybody wants to know who Bowie is, right? So
Right.
I think that's why I was drawn to writing about those records. The essay developed further. I originally published a form of it. It was a little bit more straightforward, I think, than the essay that appears here. But I published it in Pop Matters.
Yeah.
And I was just
Great.
like,
Shorter, but
what?
it's great.
Yeah, I was like, what? Let's just do this.
Right.
Let's just see how it goes. And it did get a pretty good reaction. And it kind of went quasi viral. It was retweeted
cool.
by Brian Eno's camp. So that was
Wow,
cool.
that's great.
Yeah, so that was cool. But one quote that I wrote down, it was in a book. It was from a book written by the poet Cynthia Cruz,
Uh-huh.
and the critic and the Germanist Cynthia Cruz. She was writing about I'm trying to think of the name of the actress. Kirsten Dunst in Lars von Trier's movie Melancholia, and she wrote that the character mourns the future without knowing what she's lost in it.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where the idea of Bowie mourning the future, what is lost because of this pervading, system that we have, whether you want to call it, the crushing force of capitalism or what have you, kind of what we were talking about Romanticism being a modernity's critique of itself.
Right.
So that quote kind of turned me on to writing about a little bit more. So, and that kind of helped the essay evolve from what it was when it was published online to what you see in the book. And I was able to find another source, a book by this guy, August Weidman, an art and literary critic. He wrote a book called Romantic Roots in Modern Art.
And that was very useful.
Yeah, that was a huge kind of turning point to go back and revise the essay. But I always go back to Bowie. Honestly, like my relationship with Bowie, to answer your question about my relationship with Bowie, is it's kind of like Romanticism's relationship with modernity.
Right.
Like I'm always going back to it.
I'm worried now.
Yeah.
Go.
And I'm always, and I don't know if I would write the same essay now
Right.
that I did 7 years ago or 4 years ago when I revised it.
Right.
It's constantly evolving. And now, like lately, I've been listening to Black Star a lot.
Yeah.
And Black Star came out when I was working on the essay, I believe, originally. But yeah, now I'm going back to Black Star a lot. And I saw last year, my wife and I actually saw the bassist from Black Star live with Rachel Eckroth.
Oh,
Doing
great.
some experimental jazz at a really small club in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I
Yeah.
live north of Boston, so I was able to see, Tim Lefebvre do his thing, which is really cool. One of my
Right.
favorite bass players, just incredible performance on Black Star. But yeah, now I'm deep into Black Star.
Yeah.
So the records that I attach to are always different. I think I will go back to the Berlin period a little bit more this fall. I was just working on a fall playlist and I added a ton of that stuff onto it. So
Oh, that's great.
yeah.
Those are some interesting projects. So your argument in your chapter, how would you summarize that?
How would I summarize it? I would summarize it as in basically, I don't know, I have that Bowie is trying to express alienation in a way that transcends the mundane reality that we live in, even the lingual world that we live in, and succeeds at doing that through Lowe. When he creates his own sort of language on the instrumental tracks with Brian Eno, and even through the sublime aspects of part 2 of Lowe, and on Heroes, when he basically rediscovers paradise in the present reality through witnessing lovers by the Berlin Wall. He's able to transcend the mundane reality of existence and capitalist realism, if you want to go into like a Mark Fisher way of looking at it. But he kind of transcends that through just the act of love in Heroes. And that's kind of what the essay is about. I don't really get into Lodger. I think I do at the end, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not even really a Berlin album. It's always included in the Berlin trilogy, but he made the whole thing in Switzerland.
He did the whole thing in Switzerland, yeah. And there is a form of romantic, I kind of thought this would be a different essay, but there is the romantic theme of restless travel.
Yeah.
And more like escapism.
Right.
On Lodger.
Right.
But this was something that I sort of got into a little bit at the end to kind of tie things up, but the seed of a different essay is there. And it is a different form of romantic escape, I think.
Right. When you mention that, I can't help but think of Always Crashing in the Same Car.
Yeah, man, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I love that too.
You try to get away.
Yeah, but you're always crashing in the same car.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me look into your chapter a bit. Hold on a minute. And you do, and this is interesting when you talk about melancholia and on page 143, and you bring in a discussion of capitalism, refusal to adjust to the conditions of capitalist realism may result in symptoms that the contemporary medical community associates with clinical depression. Yet expressions of melancholia create fresh symbolic forms of communicating qualitative ideas and ideals that modernity renders otherwise unspeakable. So that's really interesting to me. Do you want to elaborate on that, or?
Oh yeah, for sure. This is on page 143.
Yeah, it's on page 143.
I have my book. I got it a little bit. I think I got it a little bit later than everybody, but I'm loving it.
You got it. That's the main thing. Did everybody get their copies? If you didn't get your copy, let me know after the meeting.
Yeah. So this part is basically laying the framework for the essay, but also at the heart of what the thesis of the essay is. Mourning the Future itself the future that we sort of can't have because of what reality has, what we've created for ourselves with modernity. When we're mourning that loss of the future, we create the future, right? So David Bowie is creating a new sound and a new way of expressing himself on these records in particular. He's doing it throughout his whole career, obviously, but on Low, he is creating his own language. And he needed to do that. He needed to create a new sense of self and who he was, especially coming out of a period. And I think somebody was just talking about this, but coming off of his dark period of drug use with Station to Station, going from his next record. I mean, Low is like his detox record.
Right, it is totally.
No, it really is. And he needed to create a new language to do that and figure out who David Bowie even is. Not David Jones, but like you say, that canvas that's David Bowie. Who is that? What is the artist David Bowie? We get into that on Low, I think. We get into that a little bit more than we do even on Heroes. Low might be even his most deeply personal record. And he goes on the record saying it was genuine. Right? It was a really, it was a form of self-expression. And this is really interesting because Bowie hasn't really described any of his other records as being like that.
Right.
So that kind of,
yeah, it's rare. It's like he avoids self-expression. Like the whole point is not be a form of self-expression.
Yeah. So there was something going on with the self there. A reinvention, maybe. You know, as always, you know, David Bowie has to reinvent, but he had to reinvent the idea of David Bowie on Low. Obviously Brian Eno helped him do that. But I know I'm getting a little bit away from the question.
No, that's okay.
But I think that the it takes us back to the act of creation and the creation of language, the creation of what it's like to kind of bask in like that origination, you know, and what that maybe feels like. So he's kind of telling you what that feels like on Low. He's instead of describing it, you're enacting, you know, you're enacting this originary situation, this chaos, right? It's a dense, you know, tapestry, you know, and it might be his most kind of, in a way, it might be his most stripped down record.
Right.
The way that the instruments are recorded, the way that the bass is recorded, the way that the synthesizers appear, everything very much stands out on its own. So I'm not sure what I'm trying to get at with this, but does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. And Marsawa, I mean, you know, that long droning kind of quiet instrumental, you know, there's not much that's like that anywhere else.
Yeah.
Always, you know, and you can, and I remember when he was talking about it, he was trying to capture the feeling of this, you know, brutalist architecture and you know, countryside of Poland and, you know, parts of Eastern Europe. And I think that reflected his feelings about himself and what he was coming out of at the time.
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
a feeling of feeling like the future has already happened and you're almost feeling nostalgic about
before you even get there.
Before you even get there, you're feeling nostalgic about it. It's already slipped away.
Right.
Trying to capture it within the moment, and you're trying to let it bleed out in a new kind of language.
Right.
And that's what's happening on Low, in particular.
Yeah, that's a really interesting variation, because nostalgia for a lost past is often cited as a defining characteristic of romantic art and literature, and he's nostalgic for a lost future.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, and it's an expression of his own melancholy, but it's a productive one. It's not necessarily, defeating.
I think
Alright.
it can't be overstated too how much Berlin as a city plays
Right.
into that feeling of nostalgia. I'm teaching a new German cinema class right now, and I just had them watch Wings of Desire, and
Oh,
it's this
great.
movie. It's all about the divided
Brilliant.
Berlin, and
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it in years, and certainly not since I'd written the Bowie article for this book. And right, like it that quote you keep repeating, Paul, like it's manifested in that movie, like, because on one side of the wall you've got this communist future that frankly is like pretty bleak, and then
Right.
on the side Bowie is living on, right, the West Berliners, like West Berlin was like this sort of outpost of capitalism. So,
Right.
and they really tried to advertise that. The first place wall jumpers that made it successfully across were brought to was the KaDeWe, Kaufhaus des Westens. They were brought to a shopping mall before they were in the process. They're like, look what we've got. And you can like, and so Bowie's kind of confronting these two futures that are both kind of shitty, right? And living in the middle of this and that division. I mean, and it's not just Bowie. Like Berlin is so inspiration. Nick Cave is in that movie, Wings of Desire, right? Like,
He performs, right? He has a performance in that.
Yeah, he's got a performance in it.
Yeah.
And right, and artists came to Berlin in the 70s and 80s to produce exactly that sort of art, right? And Bowie is one of the first to sort of show that it could be done, right?
Right.
But there's no Joy Division without Lowe either.
Right.
There's no like that. They don't. So anyway, I'm just chiming in with like, because I wanted to ask you, Paul, about the whole like Berlin triptych thing, and because my article was on similar subject matter, and there was an article, it's in another book collection about Bowie, where it talks about like the myths of the Berlin period. Myth one,
Right.
only one album was recorded in Berlin, like yada yada. Like, we shouldn't refer to it this way, and
I'm trying to embrace. I think in my essay, I'm trying to embrace the mythopoesis of it, and not really trying to debunk the myths of David Bowie in Berlin. I'm trying to let those speak for themselves a little bit. In fact, I believe that David Bowie is responsible for creating those myths himself.
Yes,
So
he
he
is.
would allow them to, take their own course in some sense. But it wasn't my intention to deconstruct any of those myths of David Bowie in Berlin, right? We have the picture of David Bowie with the cap smoking a cigarette in Berlin, looking really cool. And, he's hanging out with Iggy Pop and he's very brooding.
Hog.
Yeah, but he was happy, during this time period. It was a period of rebirth and renewal for him. So it wasn't this kind of bleak, it wasn't all this kind of bleak melancholia. There was a sense that, through this melancholia, I'm creating something new and visceral and real, and it's capable of reconstructing the world, right? Like, and that's what Romanticism at its very grand enterprises in the very beginning, and sometimes critics forget this, but Romanticism was at one point in time almost capable of rebuilding the world, right, as we know it. And that was its intention, maybe. And through romantic irony, we see that, maybe it's not capable of doing that, right? But we, I don't know what I'm getting at, but there's something authentic to, this kind of romantic myth making that's going on Lowe, I think. I don't know so much about Heroes, right? It's a little bit of a different beast.
Well, Lowe's got these happy, like it combines that melancholy with like blissful moments, like the blissful moments in a new career in a new town, or
Yeah.
Sound and Vision, right? Which is a song
Yeah.
about sitting alone in your room, and yet it's like probably his most upbeat single of like the late 70s.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it's on Heroes as much. I think A Secret Life of Arabia has a bit of that, maybe, but yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
Heroes
Oh,
is
you
a
go-
totally different beast. Like they're all such different records. It's weird to talk about them together, but you know, yeah. I think side 2 of Heroes is better than side 2 of Low, but that's my personal opinion because I think side 2 of Low is, I don't know. It's just, it doesn't break up the sadness. Whereas like Heroes, like you get it crescendos back.
It goes down to sleep in the sadness. It lays down to sleep. So, well, just for some context, Julian's essay is also on the Berlin period, and the studio in which they recorded is Hansa Studios, right? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
It was within sight of the Berlin Wall. Okay. So so this is, I mean, it's like right on the edge of the border between East and West Berlin, and they could see the guard towers, Soviet guard towers, the guys holding the rifles. And there's this vague feeling like, are they going to shoot us? You know, so that's all like, you know, any, you know, and the Bowie referred to Low, Heroes, and Lodger as his Berlin trilogy or Berlin triptych. And Lodger was not recorded at all in Berlin. Bowie's Berlin albums were 2 albums with Iggy Pop. He finished up Low in Berlin, but started it elsewhere. And then Heroes was completely within Berlin. The last thing he recorded in Berlin was Bale with Tony Visconti, and that's a stage performance of his. So there's actually 5 albums, and Lodger is in one of them. But what they have in common, those 3 really, is Brian Eno. You know, that's what you can call it, the Eno trilogy. You know, they are all kind of combined together that way, you know. So anyways, all right, well, anything else, Paul? Anything you want to add? Any other questions for Paul?
I just wanted to say thank you, you know, for
thank you
for sticking with me for 7 years.
You were worth it.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I'm glad that first version, the shorter version, got published on the website, and it was great and got attention, and you really beefed it up well for this collection, and it's a great contribution. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm glad you stuck with me all that time too. So,
I have a question for you, Paul. I've got a question. So I love, Jim, how you've been very teacherly in directing us to specific pages.
Yeah.
And so I'll do the same, since I don't get to teach very often these days in my new role. So on page 142, Jim, you talk about the power of myth.
Yeah.
So, and I'm thinking not only about the Berlin period, the so-called Berlin trilogy, but I'm thinking about the complete arc of David Bowie's career. How would you characterize the myth of David Bowie, and what makes it mythic?
Oh man.
Yeah.
It's all, yeah. So every step of the way, it's reflecting. Every choice that he makes is so specific to the time, to who he is. It's so carefully crafted what he's putting out there. And he doesn't give you everything. He gives you what you need at that current moment, right? And this is, I think, the way that he creates myths. He's reflecting something within, he's reflecting something without. It's all so careful, and it's what we need at that given moment, at that cultural moment. And that's, I think, what makes it mythic, right? Because it's stories that we can share about those times, about the future that never happened, or what have you. And he's able to, and it's able to resonate, and in sort of a timeless way. It's and that's why we still, like, for example, at the bookstore I work at, why we have a myth section. When people still read The Power of Myth, they still buy, collections of mythology. They want these stories that reflect who we are. And Bowie's able to do that, in not just and not just sort of blink out. It remains timeless. That's kind of one. I know that's really, really generic answer, but I think that's sort of like what my heart is telling me to say.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, all right. So Jennifer Lodine-Chaffey is up next. Are you ready, Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let me just reintroduce what we're doing here. Virtual book launch, David Bowie and Romanticism. We're talking to all the contributors. It's an edited collection. And we're live on location at Savvy Vinyl Records in Melbourne, Florida. The most important Melbourne in the world. Jim Morrison was here. And at savvyvinylrecords.com. And we have Jennifer's chapter and then Julian's, and then we're going to wrap up. So and Jennifer, let me introduce you. Can I call you Jennifer? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, you can call me
I
Jennifer.
feel like I know y'all. So let me read the introduction in the book here. Dr. Jennifer Lodine-Chaffey, is that correct?
Lodine-Chaffey.
Lodine-Chaffey. Is that it? Lodine-Chaffey?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is the first time I'm meeting everyone. Is assistant professor of English, Department of English, Philosophy and Modern Languages. Are you still in Montana State University? Or did you
Yes,
move?
that's where I am now. I was in Oklahoma previously.
Okay, I knew you had a recent update. I'm glad it's captured in the book. She is the author of A Weak Woman in a Strong Battle, Women in Public Execution in Early Modern England, University of Alabama Press, 2022, as well as a number of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on Christopher Marlowe's dramas, early modern engagements with death and capital punishment in the 16th and 17th centuries. So I should point out, we're talking to an early modern scholar here who stretched herself. Her discussion of the Ars Moriendi tradition begins, maybe even proceeding with the early modern period, and she stretches it for us, through Romanticism into the 21st century with Bowie's Black Star. So and
Jim, it reminds me, the first likable Satan is Marlowe's.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Mephistopheles.
Yeah, Mephistopheles. Yeah, he's just a minor demon. We certainly like him more than the other guy. So her chapter is titled Black Star, David Bowie's 21st Century Ars Moriendi. So could you define Ars Moriendi really quick at the beginning and then talk to us about you and David Bowie in that tradition?
Yeah, so the Ars Moriendi is basically the craft or art of dying. And it began as this series of books that included text and woodcuts that people would read throughout Europe, starting in about the 15th century, mostly predominant in the 16th and 17th century. And they would look at these books that would kind of let them know the things that they were supposed to do to make their soul right, their relationship with their community right, and kind of have everything in order. And the woodcuts are actually kind of hilarious to look at from a modern perspective, because basically it'll always be this individual in this bed who is dying, and there'll be one woodcut that's about temptations that are going to make this person doubt God, think about their sins, that they're never going to be forgiven. And these demons are kind of hilarious. They look like Muppets, if you've ever looked at them.
They're Satan Muppets. That's what they
yeah, they're kind of adorable. And then in the next one, there'll always be like an angel or the Virgin Mary or Christ appearing to remind this person, to repent and get right with God. But there's also all these instructions about what you're supposed to do if you're people visiting somebody dying, if you're community members, if you're the priest. And some of the things people were told to do are a bit odd, like actually pretend that you're dead was one of them. Try to take everything out of your head, lay as still as you can on the floor. Think of what it's going to feel like to be really dead, because if you make this a habit and practice being dead, it's going to be okay when you're actually dead, because you have already practiced this. And I want to note, we actually have another early modernist here, Alice Daly, and I have her book in my room, amazingly, but yes, How to Do Things with Dead People. And she actually writes about Bowie in her book as well. So there must be something about Bowie and early modernists. And her son actually dresses up in various Bowie persona and has images. So you might want to check out her book too.
Yeah, maybe she can talk to us a little bit when you're done. Would that be cool?
Yeah.
I jump in for a second and say that early modern is where I started also.
Oh, wow, great.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's so kind of you.
Oh, yeah, I really enjoyed your book, Alice. So just a bit about kind of me and Bowie. I came to Bowie as a teenager, started with Changes actually, but then I bought Outside and Earthling when I was so my intro to Bowie is that Bowie was more the Outside Bowie. And then I bought a whole bunch of Tin Machine, or both the Tin Machine albums. I don't really listen to them much anymore, but Bowie, yes. And Bowie passed away right while I was finishing up my dissertation.
Wow.
And I was writing my dissertation on early modern engagements with death and mortality. So it was this weird juxtaposition. And I would actually drive to campus and listen to Black Star every day as I was on, and then I'd work on my dissertation. So it was this really interesting mix. And when I started working on this piece, it was actually a conference presentation that I gave at the Pacific and Ancient Modern Languages Association. and it was actually just early modern. It wasn't romantic yet, because what I noticed from watching the video of Lazarus were all of these resonances with the Ars Moriendi tradition, and things like wanting to build a community, reminding people of, who you were so that your posthumous identity is going to carry into the future, almost in a way like Shakespeare describes in his sonnets. And I also, this didn't really get in the chapter, but I also found a lot of artwork with these kind of coffin-like wardrobes, almost like the one that Bowie went into, sometimes with demons going in or out, or angelic beings going in and out. And I thought, this is probably not a coincidence. Right. So I really started, trying to see all the things that were in the video that related to this tradition that was very important to me. And part of why I studied death and why I found Bowie's death interesting is because in our modern world, we've really lost a sense of community, of identity in death. And I feel like Bowie, especially in his final album and in his final music video, tried to present this artful approach to death and dying that I really feel, most of us, hopefully we're not going to, die alone in hospitals or not with our family, but I feel like death has become very commercialized. And Bowie actually seemed concerned about that himself, because he was reading, there's this one book from the 60s, it was all an expose of the death industry, and it was listed in Bowie's top books that was posted online. So I really felt like that's what Bowie was doing. And then when I started thinking more about the Romantics, I delved into kind of the history of how they approached death, which was also kind of a return to early modern rituals. It was the age of the beautiful death, so that we have people actually more embracing death, seeing it as a possible transcendence, wanting to memorialize people. And when I looked at the poetry of Wordsworth and Keats, I saw these elements there that, death was thought of as something that you're kind of, once again, like Shakespeare's sonnets, you're going to have, this ode on a Grecian urn, and that image is going to carry on and kind of continue part of the legacy or identity of the individual.
Wow.
So I really felt Bowie was doing that.
Yeah, and it's deliberate on his point, you know, in his case. Like he knows what he's doing,
Yeah.
you know, when he makes these allusions. So what did your excursion into the Romantic era, did that change your view of your early modern predecessors? Is that going to inform your view of the early modern period? To move things around a
Well,
bit.
I do see definitely some amount of what's going on with the metaphysical poets, I feel like was going on in the Romantic era as well. And that there's this sense that there's something beyond just the rational, logical world and this kind of transcendence that can occur. And I felt that both of those periods, you know, have this kind of belief in that possibility.
Oh, okay. All right. That's interesting. How do you
So,
feel Bowie relates to that? I'm sorry, I'm having to adjust my camera here on my phone. How do you feel Bowie does he modify that tradition? Does he add to it or develop it?
yeah, I think he's developing it more for our modern era, because the way that he's creating his own artful approach to death is relying on, you know, video. So you have not only, you know, song, but you also have video, which is for a modern era. And he is relying on fans kind of as his community. It's not just his family members. Yes, David Jones had, you know, private death with his
Right.
family, but I feel like this was his attempt to kind of bring in these other past personas within the video, which Samuel also mentioned that I noticed in his book chapter as well. So there's a sense of a much larger community that he could create, and a way that he's doing it using modern media that they didn't have in either of the eras that I'm discussing or interested in.
Right. So what else would you like to say about Black Star in particular? That's just an amazing album. I mean, you know, musically and the way it presents itself, the whole thing is black. The lyrics are printed gloss black on matte black, so you kind of have to tilt the lyrics, you know, the booklet to be able to read them. And then the videos too, it seems like you discussed the videos in some detail, if I recall, right?
Yes.
What what more would you like to say about Black Star in particular as part of this tradition? You talk about the video for Lazarus too.
Yeah, Lazarus is the main one that I focused on, just because I saw so many elements within the lyrics and within the video itself that echoed the tradition I was looking at, but also I think got to some of the romantic ideas of death as a beautiful thing as well.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Tony Visconti said it best when, you know, that this was a parting gift to fans.
Yeah.
This was a creation that he knew that he was dying. And I guess for all of us, you know, someday we'll pass on. I hope to be able to maybe make something, obviously not Black Star, but, you know, that would, you know, carry my identity forward in a way, or have a parting gift for a community.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think the other thing that I didn't mention is that Bowie, or I should say David Jones, protected his privacy.
Yeah.
Because it's a parting gift, but it's the David Bowie parting gift. It's not the David Jones parting gift. I think we've all been discussing that difference between, you know, the actual persona of Bowie versus the real person of David Jones. And so there's this sense that he was also able to do this, like this one public goodbye, but his private goodbye was separate. So he wasn't placing himself in the public eye in an exploitative way that would harm him, because he kept his illness secret. So yeah.
From Brian Eno. Brian Eno called him really close. I mean, not long before he died, and said to him, I'd like us to make another album together. What do you think? And Bowie's response was, yeah, I'd really like that. And then not long afterwards, he died. He didn't even tell Brian Eno.
Yeah.
And he's working on Lazarus as a stage play, at the very end there around the same time. And I believe he was able to see it opening night, but he didn't last much longer after that. So Lazarus is like a key text for him as well. So are any questions?
I always have questions. I have a question. Thank you, Jennifer, for referencing my chapter. The Lazarus video will always be so complicated because when it was filmed, that was the week that Bowie knew he had a terminal condition. The treatment was stopping. It's almost impossible to receive and read the whole Black Star album and the Lazarus video outside of that context. But I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the Lazarus video and the Black Star video, because there are visual iconographic references in Lazarus to Black Star. So he has the same sleeve, he's wearing the same outfit in the hospital bed, and so on. There's the holding of the black book in which he's furiously scribbling in Lazarus as if he just, he must get something down before something ends, whether it's the song or the video or his life. When you go back and watch those two videos, and again, it's impossible to separate those from the context of his imminent death, but when you watch those two videos, what do you think about? What do you see in those two videos?
Yeah, one thing that I do see definitely is this engagement with his past identities. I mean, definitely in Black Star, we see kind of references to Major Tom, and there's the skull inside the helmet.
Right.
There. And then you get the kind of station to station, the photo shoot reference as he's going into the wardrobe. So that's one thing that they both have in common. I think that I feel like that was deliberately done for fans. And I might be reading into that or misconstruing it in some way, but it seems very deliberate that he would choose that. I thought about writing about the Black Star video, but it honestly is more confusing to me than the Lazarus video. And I think part of it is the odd kind of shaking dance movement that I have never quite figured out what that means exactly. And then I'm not sure what to do with the Christian iconography of the three executed victims. But then you also have this odd phrase, I mean, the at the center of it all phrase, which to me brings up a whole bunch of other authors. And I think of like William Butler Yeats and T.S. Eliot, and I'm not sure what to make of it. So I guess I should tell you, like, I see resonances, but I am still very confused by the Black Star video, and I'll probably just keep watching it and be haunted by it for years.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and I don't know if you all know, but there was a website, I guess it's still there, called thevillageoformond.com. That I didn't know about. I think most of us didn't know about until after David Bowie died. But a lot of the references in the video Black Star were there first. I mean, it's a fascinating multimedia kind of thing that happened that we became aware of after his death. So thank you for that. I mean, I also think the Black Star video is so overwhelming and so confusing, and there's so much there. So thank you for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel.
Any ideas? I saw Moon Age Daydream last night, a recent documentary, the first one released by the Bowie estate, and they have clips from the Black Star album videos, and there's a young woman in like a house dress, a young woman, she's approaching the astronaut in the space suit. She looks in, and the skull is in behind that he's dead. And then she's reverently carrying the skull to a city, and she has a tail. Do you have any insight into that?
I mean, it kind of reminded me of Diamond Dogs, but
Yeah,
that,
right.
yeah.
You know, does it remind you of like little figures in medieval illustrations?
Yeah, it does a bit. I mean, I found because I mostly study public executions, I was very drawn to that song because the mention, on the day of execution.
Right.
And so I've wanted, maybe I'll return to just try to look at Black Star someday.
Yeah. Yeah. And he calls it an execution. I mean, he's dying of cancer and he calls it an execution, and that's an interesting way to think about it. I didn't want this as being forced on me. You wonder if he's, if there's some kind of self-reflective sense of guilt, maybe, I don't know. But it's interesting that I called it an execution to begin with.
Yeah.
It was literally not that, so, okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Alice, and after you ask your question, I'd like you to talk a couple minutes about your book and how you discuss David Bowie in it.
Oh, sure. But let me ask Jennifer. I'm so excited to read your chapter, and Maggie Vintner has a Bowie like coda in her book on.
Oh,
yeah. So it's not even just the two of us.
wow.
Yeah. So I have two questions for you, and I really look forward to reading this whole volume. One is, it's just been forever since I looked at the Ars Moriendi woodcuts, and I'm curious about whether you saw any sort of echoes of that iconography in especially the Lazarus video, but possibly also Black Star too, though I understand what you're saying about its complexity. So that's my first question. The other is, whether I do this very brief, I mean, I just kind of mention it in my bit on Bowie, to think about Hamlet and the skull and cracked actor and meditations on death. And I'm wondering if that's something that you talk about at all or have more to say about than I managed to get to.
Yeah. So as far as the video and the Ars Moriendi woodcuts, I actually did notice some significant similarities. So for one thing, Bowie's in the bed. At one point, there is a figure underneath the bed, almost like the Ars Moriendi demons. And then in the very next cut, there's actually a kind of white, almost angelic figure up against the wall. And that's when Bowie sort of throws his arms open. So I felt like that really echoed the Ars Moriendi woodcuts, strangely. And it's very brief. Like when I tried to give the talk, I created a PowerPoint presentation. I had to go through the video so many times and try to pause it at just the right second, but it's there, which was fascinating to me. So that's definitely there. And then your second question, I'm sorry, can you repeat your second question, Alice?
Hamlet.
Oh, okay. Yes. So actually, I have always wondered if in Cracked Actor, the skull is actually Gloriana's skull. Because to me, like, he also has, the song "'Tis Pity," she was a whore. And so he obviously seems very steeped in that. So I've been very curious because oftentimes in that particular, in the Revengers tragedy, there is like this kissing, making out with the skull. And then of course the skull is used and set on this corpse to kill someone. And so I've almost wondered if that was what he was referencing. And I'm not completely sure, but it doesn't seem to me to represent Yorick because of the way Bowie treated the skull in Cracked Actor. So I do briefly mention that in the chapter because I think that throughout his life, Bowie was actually fascinated with death and thinking about death. And I mean, from the very beginning, like, please, Mr. Gravedigger, we have all of this. Bring me the head of the Disco King. They're all like kind of referring or thinking about death and his future death. So thank you, Alice.
That's very cool.
So Alice, could you tell us a little bit about your book and how Bowie ties in? You mind if
Yeah.
I call you Alice? I mean,
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm Jim.
Just
Hi.
very briefly, my book is called How to Do Things with Dead People, History, Technology, and Temporality from Shakespeare to Warhol.
Oh,
So it's mostly about Shakespeare's history plays, but it uses a lot of other material, and it's very transhistorical to think about what we do with the dead. And so one of the things what I use Bowie to consider is the kind of replication of identities that Jennifer referred to, but also to sort of think about, God, I'm completely losing my train of thought. It's Saturday.
my phone is dying. So
Yeah.
if you're on Instagram, the phone's dying. So I don't know how long I'll be on.
My son, during the course of my writing of this book, sort of by accident and absolutely not, dressed up as people I was writing about. So we had a Halloween when he was Bowie. He had a Halloween when he was Warhol. He had a school project when he was Shakespeare. And so the book is really about how the dead and reproductions of the dead complicate linear temporality and complicate models of the temporal that separate past, present, and future and allow periodization. And so I'm kind of working against that model. And so Bowie's Lazarus video in particular is what I talk about. I argue that it constructs multiple Bowies who have the prerogative to look at his own dead body, produce a Bowie who sort of reaches into the future, right? So it's a place where we can see the kind of temporal work that the rest of the book is interested in. But I also talk to them about how my child's reproductions of the dead work as ways to express love. And so that it's one of the things that we do with the dead is we use the dead to love each other, which I found to be a kind of profound and weird and troubling realization, but a really fruitful one for my project. So I don't want to.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Can you
Sure,
give
yeah.
the book title again?
It's called How to Do Things with Dead People. History, Technology, and Temporality from Shakespeare to Warhol. It's Cornell.
Okay.
It just came out in June.
Cornell? Okay, great. I'm sorry. My phone's dying. I'm trying to save it. I don't think there's any hope. Well, that is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Okay.
Thanks for sharing it.
For Alice or Jennifer? Any questions? Okay. All right. So again, if you're on Instagram, my phone is down to 10%. I've been fiddling around trying to get the charger to work. It is plugged into a charger and it's dying. So I don't know how long we're going to last on Instagram, but if you just tuned in, this is a virtual book launch for David Bowie and Romanticism, Palgrave Macmillan 2022. You can find out about it on my website, jamesrovira.com, and on link.springer.com. And it's an edited anthology, and we're having conversations with all the contributors today. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for your great contribution. And I'm really happy with the coverage in this book. I felt like everything that we had to talk about when we talk about David Bowie is covered in it. So Julian Knox is up next, and I'm going to introduce him. Let's see. Hold on a minute. Wait a minute. Julian Knox did you get promoted? Are you associate professor now? Or still assistant?
Oh, no. In fact, my brain is total mush right now because I just submitted all the tenure stuff last night.
Oh, that's right.
So,
okay, you're going through that.
Like I'm in some weird place of like, I don't have a reason to feel super stressed anymore, but I am because I don't know how to live not being fully anxious. Yeah, my wife doesn't really know what to do with me right now either. But so that's where I'm at. I'll try to make sense.
All right, I know you will. All right, so assistant professor of English at Georgia College and State University, where he teaches Romanticism, the 18th century and Victorian literature, and where he coordinates the MA program in literature. He has published articles in European Romantic Review, the Wordsworth Circle, and the Coleridge Bulletin, as well as in the book collections Rock and Romanticism, Post-Punk, Goth, and Metal as Dark Romanticisms. That's one of my previous collections. And he published about heavy metal in there. We're gonna talk about a future collaboration with heavy metal when he's done talking about his chapter here. And the Oxford Handbook of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, E.T.A. Hoffman, Transgressive Romanticism, and Transnational England, Home and Abroad, 1780 to 1860. His ongoing projects include a monograph on Coleridge and time, and an essay collection co-edited with me, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, on heavy metal and romanticism. Okay, and Julian's chapter is also on the Berlin trilogy, and it is Too Late to Be Late Again, David Bowie, the late 1970s, and Romanticism. So why don't you start talking to us about you and David Bowie and how you tie that into Romanticism?
Yeah, happy to. I came to Bowie, I think, later than most of the people in this room. I mean, I remember checking out the Sound and Vision box set from my public library, maybe like freshman year of high school, and listening to some of that. I really had no frame of reference. So, and I remember when Earthling came out and was like, oh, it's another electronica album from 1995 or whatever. I actually think Earthling's great. But it wasn't actually until like junior, senior year of college, and right at the time when my music tastes were kind of transitioning from like the classic rock radio that I grew up listening to in Connecticut to like, more under the radar stuff. And a friend of mine put on Scary Monsters, and that's when it hit me. Like, I just hadn't heard anything like that before. Like, what are these Japanese lyrics that are happening? And this like jagged guitar tone, and and I became sort of obsessive and in sort of researching that era of Bowie. And it was the same time I was getting into krautrock. So like, I think my introduction to Kraftwerk was, right around then too. And so they were all kind of part and parcel of the same thing. And of course, like Eno was right there, and Another Green World, and Before and After Science, especially, right? Like they all kind of shared this sound, and this sort of, I guess you could call it a krautrock sound. And if you know anything about me, like my first two loves musically are krautrock and metal. And that's just how it probably always be.
Going together, right? I mean,
they weirdly go together. Like a lot of the extreme black metal Satanist dudes love Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze. Like I it's really odd. I'll do something with that one day. But but by the time I was writing this, I mean, I was so excited when you proposed the volume, Jim, and I knew that I wanted to write about like Bowie in Berlin, and the whole krautrock thing. Honestly, the article ended up being less about krautrock than I initially expected. And part of it too was I actually kind of had to fall in love with Bowie again in order to write the article. And I kind of reckon with that in it, that I'd had a kind of falling out, as it were. I remember the article starts with me in grad school in LA in the early 2000s, listening to Station with my friend Nathan, and sort of suddenly having this like light bulb moment where I'm like, oh, this is postmodernism. Like that guitar sound at the beginning of Station to Station. I'm like, oh shit, now I understand all this theory that I'm like supposed to be reading. Like it made it come together. And and I started doing this, I don't even know if Amoeba Records exists anymore. It moved locations, but one of the great things about having access to record stores in LA was that vinyl in the early 2000s was so cheap. And I was able to just accumulate all this music for cheaper than CDs. I never bought new vinyl. Like that wasn't even a thing.
I've seen Julian's record collection, and it's amazing.
It's just in boxes behind me. It's just sad right now. But it'll come out now that my tenure stuff's submitted. I'll be putting it out. But like, so I started collecting krautrock just religiously, and it was before any of it was getting reissued on CD. And I think this moment happened. It was like 2004 or 5. Brian Eno was giving a talk at the Skirball Center up the road from UCLA, and I don't actually think he authorized this poster, but there was a poster on the UCLA campus that was titled "An Evening in the Company of Genius," and I remember looking at it and I'm like, oh, this asshole, like, you know, because I'd been just accumulating this krautrock, and I'm like, you know, Eno kind of brought that sound to Bowie in a lot of ways, and I'm like, y'all are taking credit where none is due, and that was the sort of like moment of disillusion with Bowie and postmodernism, and I'm like, you know, this is pastiche, there's nothing authentic here. And the piece for the book is really, like, I guess ultimately me reckoning with that, and kind of coming to see that the romantic actually coexists with the postmodern, and that in Bowie's Berlin period, like, you know, Paul talked about this, that like he has to get out of LA, he has to recover from the massive cocaine addiction and whatever he was doing recording station to station, and that there is something therapeutic about Low, and I talk about that also in terms of like the sort of paradoxical idea of returning home via Germany, and returning home also via the sort of romantic impulse that he sort of got close to, doing Low and those records. And so, you know, and so the article gets into like the Bildungsroman tradition and romantic longing, the German concept of Sehnsucht, right, which is this like sort of untranslatable or hard to translate term that, you know, the closest we get is longing in English, and it's all over Low, right? It's all over the German novel of education from the Romantic period, and sort of digging into this, you know, I came to see like I'm also a Coleridge person, and I was revisiting Coleridge's lectures on Shakespeare, and Coleridge has this point he makes pretty early on in the early lecture course, I think 1808, he calls Shakespeare a Proteus, to become by power of imagination another thing, a tree, a river, a lion, yet still the god felt to be there. And right there is this idea of shapeshifting as sort of essential to art and the process of art. And there it is in, you know, Coleridgean Romanticism. And so it just sort of got me thinking more explicitly, probably than ever before, writing this piece on sort of romantic irony and sincerity and how they kind of coexist, and how the performative doesn't necessarily negate the authentic, and that, you know, and the way a lot of critics talk about, you know, the critics that do acknowledge, and I haven't read Paul's piece yet, so, you know, I don't mean you by this, but the Wilkin book on Low, for example, like he recognizes there's something romantic happening on Low, but then he calls it like just another phase, like it's part of a bigger postmodernism that he then ditches after that. And I'm not content with that they remain sort of intertwined and side by side. And, you know, Coleridge is one example. Byron is probably a better example even, right? That like in the space of the same work, Don Juan, I'm thinking specifically, right? You have this like at times just completely flippant, raunchy, bad poet narrating and then like serious political aesthetic commitment like in the next stanza. And the figure that ends up, this is the later in the essay, I talk about the fly persona of Bono from the Achtung Baby session, which is another, and weirdly Bowie popped in on those sessions, which were among the last to be held at Hansa Studios by the Wall, apparently. And so like, and you see that kind of like the example of, because I didn't know what to do with Bono as the Fly. When Achtung Baby came out, I was the biggest U2 fan, and I was like into the serious, sincere, like preaching politics Bono, who didn't do personae. And it took me years to figure out or to appreciate Achtung Baby, because you know, like he's there in his like leather jumpsuit, pulling up women from the audience, making out with them, calling the White House, right? Like troll, like prank calling the White House,
Right.
But then singing one in the same suit, or singing, and it's like that sincerity and that total tongue-in-cheek irony are together, and that's, I think that's part of Romanticism, right? And I think that is one of the things that Romanticism, we've been talking about, like modernity and modernism, right? But like it's there, like postmodernism has to deal with it too. Like that, the and of course we're saying 18th century people, they annoyed me so much in grad school. I mean, I'm kind of one of them, right? Like everything first happened in the 18th century. And I'm sure like early modern people probably say the same truisms, right? And I don't mean to do the same thing with Romanticism at all, but like at least looking at this thing, the way I have been, or the way I've been trained to, it's like I can't read Byron or Coleridge or especially like the Schlegels or any of like the German romantics like Jean Paul. Like, how is that not postmodern? How is that not like totally like doing this David Foster Wallace type game with us?
Yeah.
So Bowie is just a cool way to talk about that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one thing. I mean, I make that argument in my dissertation, first book, Blake and Kierkegaard. Postmodernism is just romanticism after modernism. That's how I view it. It is romanticism. Romantic irony. I mean, the fourth wall breaking. All of that was in the Germans and some of the English, but. I'm sorry.
The Germans are more explicit even than the English. Like if you ever read Tieck's Puss in Boots, like it's one of those, it's a play about a play. Like the play never actually gets started because the critics are in the audience making fun of it. It's totally insane. Right. I mean, Tristram Shandy, obviously, too.
Right. And one thing I want to add for anyone online who's not familiar with Byron, that's you'll read the title and you'd read it Byron's Don Juan, but we pronounce it Don Juan because that's a bad rhyme in the text. He rhymes it with true one and new one and Juan, so that's how the poet of Don Juan pronounced it.
Yeah. I mean, what an idea to write a book as a shitty poet, right?
Right.
Like,
his rhymes were ridiculous. Funny and they're hilarious.
But that's Bowie too, right? Like that's Bowie dressing up as Pierrot the clown on Staring.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
And kind of making fun of himself at the same time that he's in these spaces of sincerity.
Mm-hmm.
Like the very first song, let's have the Japanese woman translate my lyrics and sing them first.
Right.
But yeah, it took me a while to kind of fall in love with Bowie. It didn't take me a while. I just had to listen to Low and I was like, oh fuck, this is so good. But one of the records I bought in LA was this band. No one talks about them anymore. They're called Bongwater. And they had this album called Double Bummer. And one of the songs on Double Bummer was called David Bowie Needs Ideas. Because apparently one of the band members had received a postcard in the mail from like Bowie's representatives or management saying David Bowie would be interested in collaborating with you. And rather than respond, they wrote a song about it. It's hilarious.
How can you not respond to that? David Bowie wants to talk to you and you don't respond to it. What's wrong with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, all their songs were sort of jokey like that, right?
Yeah, right. I guess
it was the late 90s, early 2000s was the age of like winking irony,
Yeah, that's true. It's postmodernism, right? So what big statement would you like to make about Bowie and the Berlin period? Is there one you would like to say? Something you'd like to leave us with? I would ask for.
Yeah, no, but like to me, it's kind of like it's the aesthetic thesis statement of Bowie's whole career. It's where he, on the one hand is as we said earlier, in one of the earlier presentations, like there's a sincerity there that we take seriously. There's Bowie like kind of expressing himself, and then there's Bowie making fun of himself at the same time and sort of ironizing himself, and that in fact, like, this is the sort of perfect example of how the romantic coexists with the postmodern, and going back to issues of periodization, like, kind of cues us into the fact that this is all kind of a tongue-in-cheek game that we're teaching to our students.
Yeah, right. Right. But it's a game, but there's real stakes in it too, in some ways. Like I mean, my dissertation is on William Blake, the Romantic poet and printmaker and painter, but also on Kierkegaard, who wrote about romantic irony for his thesis. That was his master's thesis, was on romantic irony. And one of the points of romantic irony to him, it begins with Socratic irony, which to him establishes the individual as something separate from the social environment. But romantic irony is an attempt to distance the individual from the social environment so that it can't nail that person down. It can't define them. It's a means of continually shifting positions, without settling into one. And in Kierkegaard, that creates a great deal of anxiety, and you leap out of that into the ethical stage, which also has its uses of irony too. But that's a somewhat different thing, and I feel like irony and postmodernism kind of does that work, and in David Bowie, I mean, the fact that David Jones, all right, now, one thing I write about in the introduction is David Jones, as a mid-60s pop star, had a real problem being called David Jones, because the Monkees released their first album in 1966. It was a huge hit. They had hit singles, and the lead singer was Davy Jones. Okay, and then Tom Jones releases his first album in 1966 and has a #1 single, It's Not Unusual. So David Jones had to drop the Jones name, and he was attracted to Jim Bowie, to the film The Alamo with Richard Widmark. So he adopted Bowie at that time. But at the same time, it's a distance, and we've talked about this, it's like a distancing technique. He's able to present this character to the world, and a series of characters, and that preserves him, his separateness from all of that, and some of his privacy. And what I want, like Moon Age Daydream, I don't know how much of David Jones you get in that. I don't know if it's more than just this, and I'm disappointed. And I want a film that shows us David Jones. But then I also feel like, what right do I have to ask? He's given us so much. If he wants to maintain this much of his privacy, why not let him? But still, I want to know the person behind the Bowie. I want to get to that person more. And it comes out, like in Lowe and in other ways, and indirectly. So,
and I think Lowe is one of the first times, but not the last in his career, that he does kind of have to reckon with the sort of potential of maybe having lost himself a little bit in those performances, and
yeah,
grounding
right.
himself again, that
does say that,
because you see it again in the 2000s. There's, he gives these very intimate performances, he tells stories between songs, that's a different sort of performance than, say, the Diamond Dogs tour, where you have
right.
this massive stage setup and choreography, or that whole shtick from the Let's Dance era, right? The sort of whatever that working man sort of
yeah. One thing he says in the new film Moon Age Daydream, about there's an interview clip where he says, I don't have anything to say. I'm happy. I'm content just being an entertainer. Like, he was not making a statement, and he goes through Tin Machine, and I love those albums. Okay. Everyone trashes them. I like Tin Machine, but he comes out on the other side in the 90s having something to say again. I really, and Amon is part of that, but what he saw going on in the 90s, the rise of the internet, this horrible self-disfiguring art, you know. So anyways, are there any questions for Julian? Any questions? I feel like Samuel's obligated to ask a question now.
Okay, I
He's been
will.
our question guy.
I will. Well,
You don't
well, a
have to.
comment and a question. The comment is that I love Julian. Maybe I don't love, but I laughed at the moment where you referred to your father's cassette of an album that I actually had in college. So that kind of gave me a giggle.
Yeah.
And I will also say, to acknowledge what you acknowledged to begin with in your presentation, good luck to you this year on your 10-year review.
Thank you.
I hope it all goes well for that. But what especially intrigued me about your article was your meditation on the title of the compilation Changes One Bowie. And I was actually thinking yesterday about compilations and how complicated a compilation is, because everything in a compilation is totally decontextualized and then totally recontextualized. And if you are a person who is just dipping into an artist because of the hits, a compilation is great. But if you're a person who loves an artist or wants to know more about an artist, a compilation is complicated. So talk to us a bit about your meditation on just the semantics of Changes One Bowie and your thoughts on that compilation.
Oh yeah, thanks. That yeah, I think Changes One Bowie is one of those, like, because there's no, in the way it's printed, there's no spacing between the words, and so suddenly we are faced with like multiple syntactical possibilities for how to read this statement. It's probably the most brilliant name for a compilation ever, right? And the way you said it now makes me think like, well, oh, Bowie changes one, like you are changed listening to Bowie.
Right.
But then the way I talk about it in the article is, right, changes, and this is a Coleridgean reading, right? Changes, multeity, and I think, Paul, you mentioned this in your article too. Or it's via Abrams, multeity and unity. Multeity, unity, Bowie, right? Like the changes, the multiples, the one, and then changes giving over to unity, or multiplicity giving over to unity, unity giving to multiplicity, which is how Coleridge ultimately defines beauty. Like he's on a quest in the 1810s to define beauty over the course of his lectures, and that's the one definite, like it changes, like he has a bunch of but the multeity and unity is the one that sort of winds up in Biographia, and that he sticks with, and it's a constant flux between the many and the one. And right, and so like I read Bowie as positioning himself as this kind of Prospero like conjurer of multiples and oneness. But as far as your question with compilations, it's funny, like I don't know if there was a recent compilation put out of Bowie's Berlin years called A New Career in a New Town. And I think Visconti produced it, and I think it contains sort of like slightly, they're not different cuts, but they're different mixes of the material. You can really hear it on Lodger. Like I think the Lodger tracks on that compilation are sort of different from the one I have on vinyl, at least. And I don't know, something about the way that they are, even though it's the songs we all know, their arrangement in that configuration at least got me to revisit Bowie and think about him in different ways than before. I was kind of low-key making fun of Jim on Instagram the other week because he posted a photo of Black Sabbath We Sold Our Soul for Rock and Roll compilation, which is like their first greatest hits, and I'm like, but Jim, you already have all these songs on full-length Sabbath albums.
Right.
But listening to a compilation right? Like changes your experience, even if you are a big fan. And this is something the Romantics are, right, well practiced
Plus
at.
it was on
You know, I don't know if that's what your
color
question is getting at, but think of how many times Wordsworth like rearranges the same poems
Yeah.
in lyrical ballads,
Or
right?
breaking the song
And
finish.
right,
and
yeah.
each arrangement actually hits differently. That
Yeah.
the experience of reading 1800 and then whatever one comes after 1800 is totally different, and then
Yeah.
1798 is almost a completely different book. You know, all the poems in 1798 are there in 1800, and yet the compilation has changed our lens. So anyway, that's
Well,
more just a
and it depends a
comment.
bit on the, it depends a bit also on the author of the compilation, right? So when you have something like I Select Bowie, that's different because he curated that. I don't know the production history of Changes One Bowie or Changes Two Bowie. But I know that, you know, in many cases like Wing's Greatest, for example, compilations are put out at a certain time to capitalize on the market, say usually around Christmas time.
Right.
Or because there's one more album owed to a record company and the band isn't ready for that, so the compilation becomes the album, you know, something like that. But I think that's part of that's part of what's important to know as well whenever you care about the music, is who put it together, for what audience, for what purpose, what does this collection of things say? I'll close by telling you that I actually have an 8-track of Changes One Bowie in a frame that I would show to you, but I just moved to New Orleans a few months ago, and so all my things are still not unpacked. But I had a New Year's Eve party a couple of years ago in Houston, and the son of friends of mine from church came to me and said, "What is this rectangular plastic thing with a picture of David Bowie on it?" He didn't know what the track was, which made me feel incredibly old. But
Yeah,
anyway,
right.
so thanks, Julian, for your chapter and for your comments today. I
Thanks
appreciate
for
it.
your question.
Thank you.
Compilation one's a really good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Samuel, for all of your questions. Thank you, Helen's iPad, for sitting in. I'm glad you could send your iPad.
That's
And
my
thank
mother,
you,
actually.
Sherry
That's
Truffin,
my mom
for
downstairs.
sitting in. And Sherry Truffin, I just want to repeat, is the saint who edited my dissertation in my first book 3 times. She was English department chair when I first got hired as assistant professor of English at a university where she was working, that shall not be named. And that shall not be named. And she helped me with it. She really helped my writing too. I learned the importance of conferencing. So thank you, Sherry, for joining us, and thank you, Eric and Paul and Aglaia, right? Is that right? No. Aglaia, okay. And Jennifer, and make sure you thank Alice for me, okay, Jennifer? And Samuel, thank you. And for all your questions, especially.
And are you
Julian,
gonna
thank you.
talk about the heavy metal volume?
Yes, and now Julian and I are going to talk about the next thing in this whole rock and romanticism series of books, and we're working on together. We have a CFP out called Heavy Metal and Romanticism, and we're still collecting chapters. The last time we have to talk again. Julian wanted to talk to me about it again soon, but last time we talked, we're going to continue accepting chapters until the end of the year. Maybe into January a bit. Is that still good with you? Or
Proposals, right? Not full
proposals. Yeah, chapter
Yeah.
proposals. And we have a pretty good, group of them now. We could probably run with what we have, but I'd like to collect more, and again,
I'd like to collect more. We've got like at least, and including Sherry's, like we've got at least like 5 really solid ones, I think.
Right. Right. And
So-
I'll contribute and you'll contribute, so we kind of have a book now, but I'd like to collect more, and I think I have some people that have contacted me who intend to send, at least 2 intend to send in proposals, but they're going to need some more time. They haven't sent them yet. So,
that's right.
So Julian's heavy metal vinyl collection is impressive. I'm grateful that he wanted in on this, and when I came up with it, I had him in the back of my mind You know, and that second rock and romanticism book,
Yeah.
post-punk, goth, and metal as dark romanticisms. I mean, we were already thinking about heavy metal and romanticism, but this will be a collection devoted exclusively to that. And Julian's so metal, he translates his own German texts. That's how metal he is. So-
I gave a talk on doom metal and romanticism like a month ago.
oh, great.
And so I actually got out
The
some of my metal
bars, right?
vinyls. If you want to know what metal has to do with romanticism, here's the cover of a finished doom album. Spiritus Mortis is the band. Well, this
Wow.
is you've seen this on the cover of Frankenstein.
Yeah,
This is on the cover of the
right.
North. Here's Goya's Witches Sabbath on a
Holy
Reverend
cow.
Bizarre album, right? Where's another one? Oh, here's Goya Dore's Ancient Mariner print on the cover of German black metal band Nagelfar's final album. It's just all over, like, and so yeah, I mean, it's visually there, but then I think what the book is really going to explore is like the philosophically and literarily those connections, especially. I don't think we have a proposal on sort of visual art so much, but
No,
I think
we
it's going
don't.
to play into everything.
That would be a good addition, you know.
It'll
and-
be in my chapter, if not anywhere else.
And
Right.
I think that, you know, I'll be well, I mean, assuming you all accept the abstract, but I'm working with a student and he's interested in metal mascots. So as part of our sort of look at the
Yeah.
grotesque, and so we'll, you know, we might look at the cartoonish mascots.
Yeah,
that'd be
and
interesting.
Eddie is always doing, like, I mean, Eddie has been posed and costumed in so many ways. The Iron Maiden mascot.
Right. Yeah, and the connections between metal and romanticism they're more extensive and go in directions I didn't expect, you know, when I was thinking about it. I mean, green romanticism and metal, there's a connection there. And then and there's folk metal is, in my opinion, I mean, heavy metal is has the most interesting musical developments over the last 20 years. I don't know that pop and rock are going anywhere, but metal is doing interesting things. I mean, they're including folk instrumentation from around the world, and you know, and folk compositions into heavy metal. And then there's bands like the Who, that would be HU, right? That Who, you know, where it's entirely folk instrumentation. It's not, you know, it's not metal, but it sounds metal. You know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. So and of course with the whole goth and you know and you know dark traditions, and we're in romanticism. So the connections are extensive. I'm really looking forward to what we can do with this. So you know, of course, we're still accepting proposals, and you know, I'm looking forward I'm always surprised. I always, even for myself, you know, what I wind up writing, I don't expect to say until I start writing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and there's always new stuff that's coming out that's like fleshing out kind of what we're doing. I'll try to put this in the chat. But there's like one of the black metal albums of the year about 2 years ago was by this group called Lamp of Murmur, and I'm gonna open the link to their Bandcamp here or whatever. I'm putting this in the chat now. The name of the album that they put out was it's actually called Air of Ecliptical Romanticism. And if you click on it, like, it's got the face paint, you've got the illegible band name, and right, but these very poetic song titles, and it's something that extreme metal bands just know now and embrace as part of their legacy, to the point where, you know, there's groups, even the band names, like are taken right out of Romantic poetry. There's
Right.
like at least 10 bands named like Demogorgon or Prometheus.
Right. Right.
And there's literally even one called The Sun Came Up Upon the Left. I'm like, wow, you've taken a whole line from the Ancient Mariner.
Yeah, right.
And so
Needless to say, I mean, Iron Maiden's cover of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So,
Um,
so
so I mean, but
there's a
that's
lot.
yeah. But I don't want to rewrite the black metal article because I already wrote one for you, Jim.
Right. No, there's
Rock and
so much
Romanticism
more.
book. So
Yeah.
I'm delving into the roots for this one. It's going to be Doom and Black Sabbath and Sabbath worship.
Yeah. The real
and-
danger is it's Black Sabbath and Romanticism.
Yeah, it won't be.
Yeah.
We already have enough variety, but
Yeah,
no,
I'd say we do. Yeah. So, all right, one last thing I'd like to do. Let me see if I can get Michelle here. If you can give me just a minute, and you can keep talking, Julian, and I'll see if she can say hi to us and talk to us a little bit about David Bowie. And that'll be it. That'll wrap this up. Hold on, let me see if I can grab her.
Cool. Well, thank you all for coming and staying on to hear about Romanticism and metal. You know, and if you haven't submitted an abstract and you're interested in doing that, you know, we're pretty, you know, metal is very expansive as far as genres, and there's so much to write about, and I remember being on the job market 10 years ago and mentioning to the wrong person that I was interested in Romanticism and metal, and they just sort of savaged me. They just ripped me apart for even daring to be interested in such a thing. And now there's books on it, right? And now there's academic conferences on it now, you know, and not just among academics. That, you know, metal people tend to be sort of philosophically and literarily inclined themselves, and so, you know, I'm just glad that we're able to kind of talk about this and expand it and just sort of explore, you know. So yeah, hello.
Hey, how's it going?
All right, this is
Escape.
Michelle with the one of the owner of Savvy Vinyl Records. She runs it with her mom. Melbourne, Florida, savvyvinylrecords.com. I put a few plugs in there for you.
Appreciate it, most
Yeah.
definitely.
So she's in the dedication to David Bowie and Romanticism as being one of the biggest Bowie freaks I know. So, shows up on Bowie's birthday with the lightning bolt.
I may or may not have painted my face for his birthday.
Yeah.
Stopped at the gas station and they're like, what's on your face? And I'm like,
You don't know. You don't know. I have a Black Star mask, and people say, "Oh, you're a Cowboys fan."
Oh no.
it was a bad mistake. Bad mistake.
Yeah,
It's okay.
the people who recognize it are my favorites.
Yeah.
They're so.
That's how you tell the good people
Yeah.
out there in the world. And those that call you a Cowboys fan,
Yeah.
maybe they don't have the best judgment. That's okay.
Maybe
That's all
not.
right.
Yeah. So what do you want to say about you and Bowie?
I mean, I would say that, I mean, I remember the day that we found out that he had passed, and we had known that he was sick for a while because he had, you know, publicly talked about it and that sort of thing. But it was just like really devastating that year because we lost a lot of good people that year too. But
Right. That was huge.
that was the one that like hit me in the gut, and I felt like just it was sunny outside, which is like a thing that's normal in Florida most of the time. It's either sunny or it's downpouring. But it felt like, I don't know, I guess the best explanation was like it was Dante's Inferno. It was like paradise, beautiful outside, but you feel like hell is burning inside. You're like, why? We lost him. It's not fair. There's not going to be anything more. That's it. That's all there is that we gotten from. And you appreciate the time and the beautiful artwork that he left us, flaws and all, because you wouldn't want it to be perfect. I think that's what makes us appreciate and us actually be able to identify with these people, our heroes, if you would, is that they do have flaws and they're not perfect. So that's definitely something that I felt was interesting. And of course, his draw that he just kind of had, his natural aura to like bring people in, no matter what color, age, style, whatever they might be. He was just, he had this kind of magnetism towards them. And I think people gravitated towards that. And I think we have to celebrate that when we see it in other artists. And I don't think we'll see another one in our lifetime. So I feel really lucky to even have been living in the same century as him. So I just try to, and every time I listen to a Bowie album front to start, I always feel like I hear something different, or I find some other way that it relates to what might be going on in my life. And, just try to learn from that and appreciate it. And it helps you kind of get through, because he went through a lot of stuff that most of us never have to deal with. And I just find that it's something that's you find with romanticizing music, is that that's what you're looking for. You're looking for something that you can relate with, and something that gives you joy. So, and I've never had a moment where Bowie did not give me joy. If you can think of any where Bowie might not have given you joy, then let me know. I'm curious. So I can't think of any. So that's where I'm at with as far as my slight obsession with it. That, and I have to collect all the records and have all of his stuff. And I will continue to hunt down bootlegs for
some great bootlegs. That's just what I was gonna say.
some unofficial things. And even though the recording might not be quite right, that's okay. We have some ways to adjust those things. But the recordings are still there and that sort of thing. And I'm interested to also, I'm sure there's stuff that's uncut that hasn't been put out there. So I'm always like kind of excited to wait to see what they release that's been in the vaults. Even though it wasn't finished, I like to see how he got from one thing to the other. I like to see those steps. It's kind of similar, like if you were to watch the Beatles, you could see how they were creating the songs and how they were putting them together for this most recent documentary that they've put out. I kind of hope that there's some sort of recording that we have it like, and it would be a nice treat, maybe for like a birthday or an anniversary of some certain album. That would be excellent. So I kind of always hope that there's just a little bit more out there, and I'm going to keep hunting for goodies. And I don't know, hopefully maybe somebody, if there is such thing as a reincarnation, maybe he'll get reincarnated before we go. That would be awesome. We'll have it'll be an alteration. But I also wanted to say too that I'm super happy that he was able to help influence so many other artists as well. That's something that I always had studied in art class, because I do have a degree. Oh yes, it sits on the shelf and collects dust, because it's a bachelor's in fine arts, and my specialization was photography and art history. So I would like to say that
it's in your store. That degree is all over your store.
Yeah, it was when I clean the records, I'm putting them in a better condition that they were. I'm making sure that they stay better.
You decorated the front too.
Yeah, that was fun. But I feel like that art is always something like, you see something, you take something, and then you alter it yourself. It's all appropriation. It's all been borrowed from somewhere else. If it's not borrowed from someone else, it's borrowed from something else, from nature, whatever it might be. And what we do with that is the beauty. That's where people find the beauty, and the joy is what you do with that to turn it into and make it your own, and to share that with others is your experience. And y'all as writers do that as well. So you take your experiences, you turn them, you take what you've read before, and you make it your own, you turn it into your own voice. And I feel like he did that as well, visually, fashion, lifestyle, music. So it's nice when you come across a superstar like that just shines so brightly. And thank you guys for
thank you for hosting us.
Anytime.
They did a lot of work to get the space ready and the store ready. They worked hard.
We cleaned things.
Yeah.
We hid the piles in the closet. Don't touch the closet doors.
Yeah.
You might,
on the one hand, that was an excuse to get them to clean that stuff up, which they needed. But no, thank you. Thank you for all your work. And your mom.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll be in libraries forever.
Is your inventory available online?
Yes,
to
I
order
do
from your
have a
store?
majority, not all of it, like what you see behind me, that's not even
Yeah.
listed online, just what's on
Okay.
floor. So if you go to the savvyvinylrecords.com, it'll take you to my Discogs page. So when you're searching on that webpage, there's a search bar that's up here. Don't go there because you're going to search everybody's stuff. It's basically a media selling platform that specializes in records, tapes, 8-tracks, even though those are the worst, and CDs as well, unfortunately. And there's some other like reel to reel, that
The
sort of thing.
purist.
I have my opinions, but it's okay. That's why I run the
I
store.
found my A-track, by the way. It's right.
Yeah, oh, great.
Beautiful.
That is
Oh,
beautiful.
that's awesome.
So what is the website we should go to for your inventory?
savvyvinylrecords.com. So S is in Sam, A is in Apple, V is in Victor, V is in Victor, Y is in Yankee, and then vinyl is V is in Victor, I is in Igloo, N is in Nancy, Y is in Yankee, L is in Lima, A is in Apple, and then you got records.com. So RECORDS.com.
Yeah, all one word.
Yep, together.
Great.
Not
Thanks.
case sensitive. You are
If
so
you
welcome.
don't find what you're looking for, she can almost
Yeah,
always find
Feel
it.
free. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I even got a TikTok. I haven't figured out how to really use it too well.
Yeah,
but I go
dance on it.
Yeah, I've been going for entertainment purposes, but yeah, you can reach out to me through any of those socials. You're gonna get me. So if you have questions or you've got a special piece you're hunting down, I love a good hunt. And I have people and I'll put out my tentacles and see what we can grab and pull in. So it's very pirate-like, so
Yeah.
my old derby stuff likes a good challenge. So
All right. Well, thank you.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
You did it. You did a good job. You guys,
We all
amazing.
did. It's our book. Yeah.
I'm super excited. All right, now we'll go take over the rest of the world.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for contributing and for being here. I should mention Shawna Guenther's chapter because she couldn't make it. It's on Bowie in space. Okay. And that's one of the things you have to cover. She covers Bowie space songs. And hold on. Let me just read the chapter title here. Negative capability in space, a romantic Bowie verse. So you can see where she's going with that. And she brings in discussion of the Anthropocene too, and a number of other topics. So unfortunately she couldn't make it, but I just wanted to mention that chapter. Okay, anything else before we wrap it up? And yes, we will be doing, yeah, Sherry, thank you. We're Women in Rock, Women in Romanticism is next to be released. It's supposed to come out in early October. So we're going to do a similar book launch, as probably in early November. So be on the lookout for that. And I'll be kind of talking about David Bowie and Romanticism all through October too. And then I'll start talking about Women in Rock by the end of October. So, and that's Rutledge.
What if we all wanted to come like crash the Women in Rock book
Oh
launch?
no, I'm gonna post a Zoom invitation to this group too. In Google group. So y'all are invited, and so yeah, I'll be, I've told everybody about it. I asked people to request the invitation to the Zoom meeting so it didn't get too filled and we didn't have to worry about trolls. But I sent them to everyone who asked for them, and that'll be the same thing, So I'll post the invitation to the David Bowie Google group, and y'all are welcome to join us. And that's a really great collection too. Janis Joplin, the Indigo Girls, Natalie Merchant, Alanis Morissette, Patti Smith, Beyonce, Missy Elliott. Oh, come on. I know.
St. Vincent.
St. Vincent, Sherry's chapter. How could I forget? She's sitting right here. Sherry writes about St. Vincent and Rebecca. Oh yeah, Rebecca Nesbitt, who I have to, she gave me a lot of feedback, and Sherry too. Sherry's been helping me, on the Women in Rock. Rebecca's chapter is on Jane Williams, who, as you know, Percy Shelley wrote a poem for and gave a guitar to. So, you know, the rock guitarist is not a new thing. It's not a 20th century thing. She makes a strong case for an image very similar to the rock guitarist being the modern rock guitarist being attached to guitarists all the way back to the 1700s. So, they're actually, she's actually working with a luthier, I think, I won't say his name because I won't get it right, to recreate that guitar. They're building a copy of that guitar, which is kept in the Bodleian right now in Oxford. So, you know, so she was, I mean, guitar players were kind of raunchy individuals, and she was a guitar player, Jane Williams, you know, so very transgressive there. So who else, can you think of anyone else that I may have not mentioned as far as who we cover in Women in Rock?
Susie Sue, right?
Oh yes,
Susie and the
yeah,
Banshees. Yeah.
Diana's, yeah. I always, I think
That's okay.
yeah, Susie and the Banshees, but mostly focused on Susie. Yeah, great chapter there. And I looked up online that interview where she's just a teenage girl standing behind the Sex Pistols, you know, while they're being interviewed, and the interviewer tries to flirt with her. And she's kind of rolling her eyes. So anyways, well, thank you all. Any last comments? Anybody want to say anything else before we go? Well, thank you all for coming. It meant a lot to me that you contributed and that you joined me here. And I think we have a great collection. We've done a great thing, you know. So keep in touch if you have any questions, and I'll be tagging y'all on social media if you sent me your tags. I'll be doing more of that going forward. All right, so if there's nothing else, thank you all, and I will be in touch again later. Have a good day, and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad
Thank
you're friends.
you.
Thank you.